A muffin break.
That would do, but they might be friends.
Okay. Oh, this time of the year.
Right wing of the He's really outnumbered now.
So we were leaving Christchurch conferences.
Yeah.
So we're in the airport. And Righto, are we on live stream? Okay. We might get started, team. Mia Clark, are you ready to roll? You ready? We might get going.
You're the mayor, but you're the chairman.
No, do you want to start? Are you ready? You're going to start from there. Okay. Well, look, welcome to this workshop around assets and activity plans. Welcome to those that are joining us on live stream. We have some apologies. So Tom, Councillor Campbell, Councillor Soper and Pania. The apologies. Is there any other apologies? Rhea
had also registered with everyone because she's in offshore as well.
Who's that?
She's offshore too.
Who's that?
Rhea,
yeah. Okay. Righto, so Rhiannon will sort of outline the purpose of this workshop in a minute, but it's important to remember that we are live streaming this, and the purpose of the workshop is to not make decisions, but to explore the situation, what the actual position is, and then understand the possible potential outcomes, which will then inform decision when we get into more formal decision making through committees and then council. So it is important to remember that. It's important that also we make sure we protect our right to be able to stay in the debate by keeping an open mind about what the options might be. So if we can just remember that. There isn't any public involvement in these workshops. It's a chance for councillors and mana whenua to discuss matters set up, through a forum of live stream. Public consultation will follow, and always be open around the discussions. So, everyone clear on that? Righty-ho, Rhiannon.
Kia ora, councillors. So just very brief introduction to the workshop. This is the final activity workshop. So following this workshop, all of your initial questions and feedback will be considered by the asset and activity managers as they put together their asset plans for you to consider, and as the budgets are put together. So you've got in front of you the options that will be discussed today, as well as for anyone who hasn't yet finalised their thoughts about other options for consideration. The managers will use these as they pull together their reports for your discussion and deliberation. So I think without further ado, we can move into the first topic.
Yeah, rightio. So it's Three Waters. So welcome, Russell and Erin.
Good morning, councillors. I've got the great job of running through that today, but I thought before we actually started, I would actually recognise some of my colleagues on our table over here who are the technical brains of our business. So if you add up their actual, their practical experience and their actual input into our infrastructural networks, together you start with 9 between them. So I guess really what I'm saying is, when it comes to some hard questions, they'll be the brains of the organisations. They're the engine room and have been for a very, very long time in our business. So most of the information that's here today is really because of lots of what they've done over a long time. But I think that's actually one of the strengths that we actually see from our organisation is that we actually do have that deep knowledge about what's going on. So when it comes to question times, we'll need to, I guess, have a little bit of a team effect on some of those, but happy to take some questions. I started with a few slides but ended up with about 30, so it will be a little bit of a whirlwind on the way past here, but if there's something you wish to ask, just go ahead. So today really just want to run through those topics, and really I've tried to keep it at a reasonably strategic level rather than necessarily get down to the nuts and bolts. So it's going to be reasonably high level. Going to just run through what sort of stuff that we do, which hopefully is a refresher for most, and talk about some of those key issues, some budgets, what's driving, what the sort of things that we think will be useful for you to, as decision-making time comes along. Also recognising that there is quite a bit of change in that sector, and our staff is one of our greatest assets, both within this building and also in our operations team that we run, so making sure that we understand how we'll deal with that. Having a plan a little bit about what happens if in October with the elections and bits and pieces, but also recognising at the end of the day the numbers that we're going to flash past you here about the resourcing of the sector, about how do you actually do some of the stuff, because some of the numbers are reasonably significant, and we'll need a lot of extra resource in thinking about how we, along with all of our other colleagues up and down the country, will be doing similar things on the way past. Just a very brief, I guess, hopefully overview of the affordable water reform, which I understand you've had several briefings on, but what we do know is that the entities have indicated that the first 2 years of our LTP are what they're going to take and deliver. So from a strategic perspective, you have a bit of control to make sure that in years 1 and 2 of our long-term plan, other things that are going to be started or done if the new entity is formed. And I think that's a really key point. So if your priority is potentially different from what you think the entity's priority might be going forward, you need to strategize about whether you do it now, whether you don't, whether you leave it in, whether you leave it out, because on year 3, 4 and 5 they may choose something different from what you would otherwise have chosen.
Just a question, do you want questions as you go along or right at the end?
Might just do a few of them, but happy to take them on the way past.
No, just starting off with affordable water reform now. I'm not trying to be hilarious here, but obviously if the government have signalled multiple times that they're going to be potentially borrowing $180 billion for the Three Waters reform, and this is they've stated that over and over again. Now, how does the word affordable fit in with us being a part owner of that $180 billion debt?
How are the staff supposed to answer that?
Yeah, I'll
just,
take that one.
No, but someone's written affordable up there.
Yeah,
So
no,
they've done it for a
I'll
reason.
take that one. So it was changed by the government,
Yep.
and it was a political sort of
Oh, so that's a political name.
sidestep,
The name.
in my view, potentially. But anyway,
Yeah,
it's
Where did you think it came from?
but equally the thing, and it's good you've raised this because we're here to determine what we should do
I mean,
with
we're trying
our
to be serious
infrastructure.
here.
Yeah, I know. So let's just continue on and determine where we go to with it if it changes. And the reality is it is going to change in some way, shape, or form, irrespective of what happens in October. I mean, that's the reality. It may not be in the structure in terms of the governance model if it goes a certain way, but it is going to change because Three Waters started under national.
And that is, I guess, one of the points that I made earlier was that we actually need to be able to be agile enough to understand what we're going to do next if something does change,
100%.
rather than go, oh gosh, what are we going to do and start again?
Yeah.
We need to have a plan and then actually focus about how we leverage off either A or B, and then revisit that once October's come and gone. So.
Michael.
Through yourself, Chair, just to close the previous discussion out and to try and get us back, look, we've made our position very clear from an organisation point of view in relation to the affordability and what it means from our community. I think that it's on that political lens that you just previously talked about. Today, I think you need to stay focused on what we need to do should from a Three Waters perspective regardless, and that's what I think Russell's going to be focusing on, what you need to do in your own asset side of it as current asset owners to make sure that we're doing the best for our community going forward. So just want to highlight that and say we'll battle the affordable side on a separate matter.
Wait, Gareth. Yep.
Just a quick reflection on what Michael just said. Entity J, which is Otago South, was very keen to go early. So the deadline the government set is 2026, so we're a little ways off that, obviously. And after some discussions with Michael, I've gone back to the NTU, which is the National Transition Unit, and said we're not prepared to go early. We want to, see what the new government dishes it up, and what position they will have, and that the earliest we want to go is March 2025. So that doesn't sit well with some of my colleagues, but the way I read the tea leaves at the moment is that everybody's got to agree to go. You can't have a majority vote. So we've got, I think, 7 councils in Otago South, and 6 can't agree to go early, and the 7th one be compelled to go. That's my understanding, but that's still not clear yet. So we will need to know that.
Yeah.
Because if we're deciding what we do in the next year or 2 or 3, we'll need to know whether that's ours to control or whether we're determined by the majority that sits in Entity J at the moment.
Yeah, but irrespective, we step back and we just look at the sort of what's the best thing for us to do in the city, wherever it sits and whenever it sits there.
And I think that, the final key part of that from our perspective is that we've seen a number of, plans from the NTU about varying dates where people could be asked to join, but our understanding is the minister actually holds the final decision on that, and the minister will actually set when an entity will actually be joined. So I guess that's how we position ourselves and how we continue to be ready as we can for all of the available options. But
I guess what I'm signaling is that while the minister will probably put the final stamp on it, I suspect that if there's opposition in one particular entity as opposed to another, he'll go with the easy options first. So if we're all collectively wanting to go in Entity J, we'll be right up the very front end. And there's been talk about money available as well. So, but I guess we've got to do what's right for us.
Just a quick question. Did we assume a council position on that? We may have done. I don't recall.
I'm looking across the table now.
When we go in,
about our lack of willingness to join until March 25.
Well, they just it didn't come from the other councils. It came.
Yeah, no, but did council form that opinion?
Yes, we have.
Yeah, I think we did.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, no, I just couldn't recall.
Just didn't want to get hooked up into the transfer of debt to
I understand the rationale why.
Yeah, right. Let's get back on track.
Thank you.
things I'm probably much more comfortable with. We'll talk about some of our assets, and really, this first slide is really just tries to point out the scope and depth of our asset base across our district, which includes treatment plants, reservoirs, pump stations, and we are dealing with the three waters. So we are dealing with water, stormwater, and foul sewage. So that also includes we also have the operations facilities, and we have about, I think we've looked at 35 direct staff operating those, plus our wider contracting team. We've made a reasonably broad statement that we think our assets are in pretty good health, and I guess that's the challenge that we will see over time about what that actually means and how do you demonstrate that. But I guess part of the KPIs and those sorts of things that you see in annual reporting are part of what you do. And we also suggest that there has been a good history of investment, and that's really why we've got some of the lower faults in some of our networks. And you see, obviously Wellington's an area that comes to mind where they seem to regularly feature in the media with their water mains bursting and those sorts of things, whereas you don't necessarily see the same here. So I thought I'd bring some pictures to the story today. So this is about the foul sewage network, and really on the left, it's really just the areas where reticulated sewage or disposal is actually available to residents, and we also use those boundaries at the moment to actually say, if you're inside the lines, you can do it. If you're not, you can't. And I guess that's part of the future challenge about where spatial planning will go for the city and what the city looks like going forward and being ready. Once again, you put your two to 3 year window on it. What do you want to compare to 10 years where you have less potential direct input? So those areas are obviously Bluff, Maui, Ototara, Invercargill and Kennington. So there's reasonable big chunks of our world that don't necessarily have reticulated sewage on it.
Russ, just on that, are there areas within that are easier to expand because of the way the infrastructure is constructed, or is it pretty much it's the same problem whichever way you expand?
Can we come back to that when we have some budgets that actually suggest some of those things are considerations and options for you to think about where you might invest. And in the middle slide is really just sort of shows where some of the bigger pipes and some of the important things are. Some of those red lines are actually are important in our critical mains, which pick up the disposal from the individual properties, transmit it through smaller pipes to a bigger pipe, and then generally are pumped down to Clifton. So there are some of those pipes that are really quite critical and quite key to us continuing to be able to deliver a network service across the whole of the district. And on the right hand side, I grabbed from one of the early asset plans is about the infiltration. So infiltration is when you get rainfall, typically rainfall, and how does that stormwater get into our sewer network, which puts pressure on it. So the blue's good and red's bad. So that probably is a reflection on the age of the network in those areas. And if you think about the red area, that's really the old historical Invercargill from the 1900s onwards, and that's where the effort has to go on, because the more you put in the pipes, the bigger the pipes have to be, and the more you have to treat. So going forward, how you manage that is really part of a key consideration. So, green's sort of probably the newer area, so you'd expect it to be better. So that's just really helps us a little bit to understand how our networks operate.
So, sorry, Russ, that one on the right, or my right, is it your right? Yeah, it is. That's the colouring's specifically related to stormwater or to storm and sewage?
No, it's a sewer networks.
Yes.
But it talks about infiltration. Infiltration is really when something gets into the pipes that you would, and Russell Keen's the expert in this world, but it's about dry weather flow and wet weather flow. So suddenly when it rains, we get more stuff in the pipes, and that's coming from the ground or from cross connections and those sorts of things, and that's what we have to continue to manage. And it is a reflection of the age of your network. Is one of those things.
Okay.
Moving on to the stormwater network, it's on the right hand side. We'll start. So most of the red lines, predominantly, all the red lines there are stop banks or systems where Environment Southland manage those catchments, and that's the flood protection schemes that were developed from the 1980s when we had the 84 flood. And I'm sure councillors are aware that recently that council has been working on the Stead Street stop bank and the Cobb Road stop bank. So they are the two stop banks that council currently looks after in the stormwater. Inside, I guess, the urban areas, once again the red lines are the more important pipes, and the green lines are the bigger pipes. So we've tried to show you where the big network, and it's reasonably well distributed across the city, and it has been, I guess, we just need to continue to watch how the resilience and sea level rise affects the design, how you go forward, because as sea level rises, so our capacity to get rid of stormwater decreases a little bit. So it's just a reflection on the network. Oh, sorry, I don't want to miss Alistair's piece. So this is the water reticulation network, and really we've just picked the big pipes, anything bigger than 200 diameter. So on the left hand side is really the supply network, and it's really shows what is currently taken from Branksholme and then moved through the city through a whole range of those bigger pipes, and then distributed across the city and through into Bluff. And the red dots are where our reservoirs in storage or major event, like Makaroo has a standpipe for the network, but everywhere else the red dots are a reservoir for storing water. So that's the wider picture. And on the right hand side is the area where we currently supply water to the urban areas. So we supply water in Bluff and we supply water in the Invercargill urban area. So, and those plans, the right hand plan has been extracted from the district plan because that's what we're indicating from a spatial perspective of if you live inside the blue line, you can get water. If you live outside the blue line at the moment, you can't, in broad terms. Sorry. Just a little bit of an overview diagram of how it all happens, and which is water's taken from the Reedy River, it's pumped and treated at Branksholme, brought through via some big pipes, and it's stored at our reservoirs, and you'll all have seen places like, hopefully, Waikiwis and the ones at Gala Street, and then it's distributed to the wider network into people's houses through much smaller pipes. So there is quite an extent of pipework across all of our city. And sorry, the bottom diagram is a very similar process diagram, but it's just a little, sorry, it didn't come up too good. Just thought I'd show a little bit about stepping back to the foul sewer pipes. On the top left-hand corner, the big blue lines really is trying to show how much was put in those decades. And what it really shows is that we've got some really big lines. So during those decades, there were lots of pipes installed in the city. So that's when the growth spurges in the city occurred, which were great. The problem being is when they all reach their end of life, so you've actually got to go back and fix them all at the same time. So we are a little bit blocky, and you can see that there's sort of been a big burst in the 1960s to the 60s to 70s, and then it's sort of been reasonably low. So as those pipes from the left-hand side of those graphs become aged, so our demand on our network becomes greater as well. So, and if you notice, the reflection on the stormwater is similar but not the same. We've done more since the 80s, so that's what there's I guess more red lines on the bottom. So let's just sort of get a feel of the network as a whole. On the right hand side is really just a condition rating of the pipe. So to me, you really wanted to look for where the very poor and the poor areas are. No, the purple and the blue. So, and our pipe network's in reasonable condition, but by age it is well consumed. So we shouldn't rest on our laurels and say that we've got a really great pipeline. We need to continue our renewal program, because as pipes get to the end of their lives, they do need to be replaced. Similar age profile for the water, but in this case, this is just really showing a little bit about the distribution of the size of pipes across our network. So what it really shows is that we've got a whole lot of water mains that are 100 millimetres, and we've got a very few on the right-hand side at 600, which are our supply mains. But within that, we have quite a different material type, and there are sections of that profile with the asbestos cement being that big right-hand chunk on that pie diagram, and that's I guess a series of a type of pipe that was installed reasonably frequently during the 60s and 70s. It is proving to have a life that's relatively shorter than some other materials, and it's the area where we continue to focus on our renewals. So we don't necessarily want them to fail. Obviously, a failed water main can cause quite a lot of damage. So yes, that's where the efforts continues to need to go into. And when you see the forward programs, this is what BAU looks like for the renewals team. They're addressing the asbestos cement pipes because they're reaching towards the end of the life. And that's something that over a long period, Alistair and the wider team have been sampling those pipes, continuing to estimate their lives to look for what the future life of those pipes will be. Just to finish the asset overview, I've included the asset valuation, and I believe I've got it right, pulled it together. So what it says is that we've got a replacement cost of our Three Waters asset of about $1.2 billion. Now, Michael might hopefully tell me I've got it right. So what it's broken down is about $400 million of sewer, and it's sort of split reasonably equally across the three assets. But on the right-hand side, what I pulled together was the sum of the depreciation. The depreciation is as we would see it, is how much are you consuming each year of your network, and how much should you be investing somewhere in your network to actually keep it renewed over its lifetime. So in essence, the number I'm trying to encourage you to remember is around the $18 million is the target number, and hopefully Patricia's not throwing too many things at me with that number, but that's the number that you should be investing in the Three Waters networks. That's every year for the life of the asset. So we've got a 100-year life, so that's what you're committing to.
What's the middle number, middle column?
That's the optimized depreciation. So that's its current book value. That's how much it's consumed. So it would cost us $1.2 billion to replace it. So its current value is $543 million. So by that you can see you've consumed 7/12 of its life. So you've got 5/12 of its life left. So you're about halfway, which is about where you probably want to be in terms of your network. And I think that to me is one of the numbers that said we've been continuing to invest in there, but I would suspect lots of councils, their current value is much lower as a percentage.
So and that number's derived purely from an accounting standard?
It's based around an accounting standard, but it has quite a bit of engineering input. But
yeah, go to Michael. Yeah.
Through yourself, Chair, just Russell highlighted that's the number you should be spending on your network. I just want to say, Russell, that's a bit low. And the reason I say that is because that's what you should be spending to maintain your existing network with the existing services with no growth. So just want to highlight that's the minimum you should be spending.
Right.
That depreciation number, is that based now? Obviously, it's if we did this 2 years ago with the cost of doing business, is that significantly more?
The number is based on June 22, which is the last revaluation period.
Yeah. Okay, and the cost of building and
has increased, and Patricia and I continue to wrestle with that one.
Yes, so through your chair, that figure went up across all council assets by over 10 million when we did that revaluation. So our depreciation charge went up over 10 million, more than what we had budgeted, and we had already had a go at indicating what we thought the increase would be. So it's going exponentially.
That's the asset value went up.
But the asset value determines value determines the depreciation. But that is because of the cost of doing business. It's now much more expensive to replace these assets.
Just a couple of issues about the alternative water supply that we're drilling for at the moment. Given that we've got potentially 2 years before the entity gets up and runs, I guess strategically, which is what we're looking at today, it's important, I think, that we've either got that sorted, the alternative water supply, or we don't have it sorted. Anything in between, I think, leaves us in no man's land. So if we have it sorted, then the entity takes it over and it will manage it with the cost that goes with it. If we don't, then it will get into a long line of, priorities for Entity J, which means we might sit behind, for argument's sake, Queenstown Lakes District's growth. So a couple of questions around that.
I think we're covering that later on.
We will get to that,
Yeah.
and that's certainly a nice segue into the next slide, which really starts to sort of set that strategic level. And at a high level, these are the core assets to your community. You know, your community will struggle without those three assets being delivered. So what we do also recognise is that the KPIs that have been set will continue for the next 2 years at a similar of what they are. We know that the entity is also working on a range of those, and my understanding is that we don't necessarily need to consult on those KPIs, but they still continue to be a good reflection. This is probably one of our big game changers, I think, for our council about what do you do and being ready. do recognise that going forward that there is potential that there is diminished community connection. So how you set priority for an entity where you only have a different number of seats at their table has to be something you need to think about. And I guess one of the consequential issues that we see from that is that more often than not, when we're doing renewal work, there's a lot of integration across our business between roading and the other places where we try to, and hopefully successfully, make sure we put pipes in before we seal roads and those sorts of things. We're now going to have another layer of that sort of removed from us, and we'll have to work harder in those places. So for instance, as we do things like refurbishment areas or those things where we look at the age and we can internally negotiate with ourselves to make sure that the pipes are up, perhaps replaced slightly earlier so we don't have to come back, that's the piece that we won't necessarily have that direct in-house control over. And I guess that's the next layer of that lack of direct connection. We have success with power industry, but it's a thing that is still at arm's reach. So
yeah, a couple of questions, Regan, then Trish.
Yeah, I think a guideline for how successful it will be is how well the Polytech reform's gone. So I think that's a key indicator.
Trish?
Through you, Chair. So are you inferring that there are some aspects of infrastructure we might bring forward earlier so that we can have responsibility for them in the next 2 years? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm going to answer that one very carefully. As you go through and look at the budgets that we'll signal today, as well as the rest of your budgets, you'll need to think carefully about what is the priority and which things that you think will actually still have higher priority. So you might time them at a different time. I know that the entity has used words like there's not to be any gaming going on, but I'm not sure what that actually means. But as a council, you have the opportunity to set your priorities for the next 2 years. And you need to have a plan B that actually says if there's a change somewhere in this storyline, what does 2 to 5 years look like? So,
and sorry, I think also Trish, what probably your question related to in terms of what Russell was talking about is, whilst we've had control of both our roading assets and our Three Waters assets, that enabled us, like with city centre streets, to actually go, we're going to actually go through and replace all the Three Waters infrastructure a few years early, so that we don't have to come back and tear the street up after we've just invested a whole lot of money in it. That'll become a much more complex negotiation when it's with an outside entity.
Yeah, Rangi?
Just a bit of guidance on that. Nobby and I went to Dunedin, it was a year and a half ago, met with the DIA, and the previous minister was there. And I asked the question of the DIA about our 10-year plans and our 30-year infrastructure plans, and they told us quite clearly that they are thrown out the door. They are gone. Whatever we have strategically planned.
what I can help with that is that Alistair's been working closely, providing information on our planning for the Three Waters to the NTU unit, so they can actually effectively start to build their own prioritisation plan. And I guess all the councils are looking to, or having to provide that information. So they are drawing information from the councils, because that's where the best information is about what's your asset condition, what are you proposing.
I mean, that's true, but that's what I expected. But, I mean, you know, you got no better brains than the ones we have here. Yet they told us directly, no. Yeah.
But what I can tell you is that they have directly said the first 2 years you control.
Yeah. And just to sort of Trish's question, I think, you know, what we have to determine, and talking to some other councils at the LG conference, one in particular has decided, look, we are going to take the position that we will make sure we hand it over in the best possible quality. Yeah. And partly that was sort of they can't come back and say, well, you handed to us in a below average position, so you have to live with that. But equally, I think for us, it's, you know, is there anything critical within our infrastructure that, you know, just says, look, if there is a bit of sort of inertia around investment for a period of time, we probably should be really addressing that now. Yes, we probably incur some more debt, or ratepayers pay. But if you step back from that, it's the best thing to do, because the consequences of not doing that are much higher, if that makes sense. So I think it's just trying to understand that sort of piece.
So perhaps if I run through these next couple of slides, because it's actually a really good segue into some of those really key issues. And the next couple of slides talk about the issues, and then it goes down into what those projects are. And the first one really says, as we've been talking about, how do you make sure that the key projects actually do happen? What we also need to be thinking at going forward is, how do we actually make sure we don't have risks and failure of critical assets? So some of those pipes that I showed you that were the red pipes are really, really, really key to make sure that the city continues to operate and function well. And council's invested strongly in strengthening the water supply lines in the last few years, and I think that's reaped lots of benefits. But we've got some of the projects going in the next slide which actually say some things. There's some other areas where we probably want to pull some of those things forward. We do need to make sure that we actually still have a healthy and safe work environment, because we do have a wide team, so that's not, it's there because it's actually really important. Maintaining our skill level is really, really difficult in today's market, both for us as a council and also our contractors. We've been fortunate, as I've started with, that we have some of the most knowledgeable people in the industry, and certainly within our assets here, but we're not going to be here forever. And from a city perspective, how do you make sure you keep that knowledge base even to the point for the next 2 years? How do you make sure you do some of these big things, because we don't have lots of that resource, spare resource sitting around? When you see the numbers, you'll understand what we're talking about. It's essential that we actually continue to develop relationships with iwi. Some of the consenting issues that we have are absolutely vital, that we have a strong working relationship and it's strengthened, and that partnership is actually key to that decision making, certainly around some of the foul sewer discharges from Clifton and Bluff. About what those are have huge impacts upon decision making, and the real key to that is having a strong relationship. We also have seen and heard lots about the environmental performance, so how we discharge stormwater and what sort of quality improvements. That'll be something that we'll need to work closely with ES on going forward, but there's certainly every signal that you see everywhere says that we're going to have to start to do better with our stormwater discharges. Hence, we've got some rain gardens and some other water treatment facilities, but most of our stormwater at the moment discharges straight to stream or straight to sea. So how we actually put some of those treatment issues or treatment opportunities before they discharged as our responsibility will be part of the ongoing challenge. We have a number of consents that are getting towards the completion, and there is some real pressure to push ahead on some of those. So there is some lots of urgency to actually start those conversations to understand what we're doing, and some of our forward budgets recognise that we need those consents, but until you understand what the conditions are, you can't necessarily always predict what you have to do to it. And I guess if you're not allowed, if the decision isn't to discharge to water, then you have to discharge to land. So each of those have completely different treatment options, have completely different cost options when you actually go through it. So we've tried to assess some of those and put some numbers around that. We're also signalling that there is actually a need for us to increase our network knowledge. So we want to think a bit more about how we can understand how the network will perform, so that when you come and say, can we, as a spatial planning for the wider city, develop in a certain area, we can actually have, with a higher degree of certainty, some of those models that need to be out there. So that's something that we've got models, but they need to be refreshed and increased in capacity, and that's, I guess, part of that planning. We also need to recognise that there's been lots of storm events. Auckland's the prime case, and I think the expectation of the wider public and whole of New Zealand is that we are going to see more storm events, and are we ready, and what does it mean for us? And there is a whole bunch of work that we need to be thinking about where our overland flow paths, when you saw the storm event in Auckland, I would doubt any council would be able to handle that much rain with that intensity in that location. So what does it mean to us, and what happens next, and are we ready to be ready for that big event? Because we should be, and we need to be. And as an issue, there is obviously the ongoing conversation with Environment Southland about who owns the stop bank on Stead Street, and they own all the other stop banks. Why do we have one, or why do we have two? Just need to work through that over time. And once again, it's recognising one of our key strategic issues are we don't actually have that greatest strength in either contractors and or the design capabilities locally to actually do all the works we need. So where do those people come from, and how do we manage them? That's sort of the high level. And if I just go through the projects, and then we can get on amongst this. So I've tried to break to the projects that we think are really the high level ones where you need to start thinking about your options around. And two things, there's the delivery piece, they're the sort of building pieces, and then there's some planning pieces on the next slide. So the big things that we're highlighting to you as our key issues and our big numbers are the Branksome supply lines, and you have committed to that, so that's actually you're well advanced, and when you saw the network, it's really good. We're highlighting that the Mersey Street pumped main is a critical asset that we think we need to have a better plan how we will renew its capacity, whether it's a new main or it's a reline of the existing pipe or both. And that's something that we shouldn't be waiting too long to do, because it's a pipe that's really important to us and is not performing that well, and it's at the end of its age. So it's a big pipe. It takes a lot of the city's sewage pumped from Mersey Street towards Clifton for it to run to the end of its life and not be replaced before then. We would have significant operational issues for the city. The alternative water supply, there's been lots of conversations about how that will be, and I think some of the, the consequential issues from that is the capacity, the extra capacity we're able to supply to Bluff. Aotearoa obviously has a whole lot of alternative / emergency water supplies, and what is that? What opportunity does that bring to Invercargill? At the moment, we are able to supply Bluff. We've got a commitment to supply some water to the development at Ocean Beach, but in reality, additional supply for Bluff for any big water industry would require investment across the wider network to make it happen. So, for instance, if any big development in that area or Aotearoa needs lots of water, then we need to find a way to supply lots of water to that place. Bluff operates in its normal BAU capacity, but if there's lots of development, so with the Aotearoa development, you have the opportunity to supplement the network in both ways, but there is some big dollars. We've got some projects in the options list that talk about Ototara, and if Ototara is an area where the spatial desire for the city is to grow and fill in some of the areas, we have parts of that network that are operating. If everybody was to join who could join, will operate, but there's not a lot of extra capacity. We need to strengthen and replace some of those pipes and pump stations out there. The understanding for that is, well, we've done some modelling, but we need to do some more, but that tells us that we need to replace a number of pipes if we want to, fill in some of the areas. There's big areas that are chopped out of the red square out of Ototara. If you want to fill them all in and let people build in other areas, we're going to need to invest in the network, or someone will have to. Some of the big delivery projects, consenting for Bluff is probably one of the ones that Russell Keane and a wider team are working on, because that consent is up for completion in 2020, end of 25. So by then we have to have a resource consent or an application in place. So there's lots of work and lots of effort that's going into that. and then Clifton comes along in 2029, and that is a bigger beast, and the understanding of how you might deliver that, whether it's discharged to land or water, is actually part of that relationship that we need to continue to work with iwi.
I think I just want to draw some attention to those ones, in particular Clifton, because 2029 feels like it's a really long way away. I know that there's councils that have been trying to negotiate their wastewater consents for close to 10 years. Whatever we do in this space, we're expecting it to require either a significant upgrade to the treatment plant or to pipe it to a land discharge area that will be significant as well, which means we're talking at least probably 2 to 3 years in construction of whatever that solution looks like, which when you then start getting to being into construction in 2026, that doesn't leave us a lot of time to figure out all of our different options and come up with what we're going to start building. So as much as it feels like it's a long way away, we really need to move.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions. So
yeah, look, just really for what Erin said. Now, I was going to talk to it later. I've got other stuff to bring in later about that. But about the consent and the thinking about the consent. Now, this is a key thing. 2029, that, even though you said it seems like a long way away, it's not. But this is one of those crossover things. Is it our problem or is it entities J's problem? Because, I mean, if we start doing planning and stuff now in our 2-year window that we have, I mean, look, I've just looked at New Plymouth, what they did. They bought 41 hectares, 100 acres of land specifically for discharge. We I don't know where we'd find that amount of land to pipe it to for Plan B if we can't put it out to sea. So is that something, I mean, are we worried about it now, or is that entity J's issue?
I think the key piece for me is that whether it's the entity or whether it's council, it's the community's problem. And so we want to make sure that regardless of whether we stay in the driver's seat or somebody else does, that we put the community in the best position to succeed. The other piece is with the uncertainty around water reform, I think we'd want to make sure that we don't make any decisions at the moment that we can't live with, because we simply don't know at the moment which direction this is going to go in. And the third piece being that you'll potentially be aware that when you talk about big central government agencies, that they don't tend to invest in anything without a pretty significant business case that's been run to back that up. That's something that Invercargill's got a lower level, I guess, of maturity in that space. We don't do a lot of those big chunky business cases. We're conscious that we need to do that around these ones, because our best chance of making sure that these projects get to the front of the line is to have all of that business casing work done and dusted, and these projects well justified and ready to go. Gives them the best chance that when the entity does hand over, that they're able to deliver them efficiently for the community, so the community doesn't wind up in trouble.
Just to get the answer I was after, I just want to know that obviously New Plymouth, they've got 41 hectares put aside. They've obviously got a consent for it. Now the consenting process to actually, if you did find land, the RMA process to actually get that, obviously you've got neighbours that are going to be around this land. Now, what time period, seriously, would doing it take? I mean, you know, if you start doing this, you've got to find the land, you've got to try and get consent, and I think it's 2029, it's going to come real quick.
I agree.
And you can't be reactionary in 2029. So, are we looking at buying land? Have we done that now? I mean, we should have. We should have looked at possible land by now. Because if you're raising this concern now, we should have done this.
Hang on, just come back from the things. Remember the start of the workshop, it was about, we're not trying to make decisions here. It's just
no, but Erin's just raised. She's escalated something.
But so for me, and I'll come to you in a minute, Noi, but I think, you know, the important thing to remember, I believe, is that, you know, the whole country is moving away from a very traditional historic method of get it out there into water as quickly as you can, right, to a very different approach, which is better, more acceptable way of dealing with waste, which is discharge to land, right? So, and you've highlighted that Taranaki and I think Timaru might be going through a similar thing. You know, they're leaning into some of those conversations now. From my perspective, I think, and I pick up Erin's comment about the maturity, I think as a country, our maturity around how we do this in the most effective and efficient way to do this, which is a very new model, will evolve quite quickly. And so there's risk with us sort of leaning into it too soon, because the understanding around how best to do it and how it'll look and that sort of thing. And the reality is there's a fair bit of pressure if it goes into a centrally organised entity for that entity to solve this problem, because it's well recognised that discharge to water is a burning bridge. So, you know, I think there's a level of collectivism where everyone's going to be trying to solve this problem. You don't want to be sort of an early starter on this, but that's only my perspective. You've got to be aware of it and be perhaps assessing some options, but you don't have, it's not a problem we have to solve because of what's going to change around the whole country's going to be moving to discharge to land. And that'll happen in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think you're right in that it's definitely an emerging area, and we don't have clarity yet that it's definitely going to be one way or it's definitely going to be the other way. I am aware of councils that are working through options at the moment where they are looking very likely to get consents through to still go to water with high-level treatment provided as an option. So at this stage, I don't think it's absolutely off the table. The team have definitely done work going back some years around potential areas of land that could be looked at for disposal, at least one of those already being in council's ownership. But we obviously need to work through the detail of what that would actually look like, and that's a negotiation process with iwi, with regional councils, with a whole range of different stakeholders, as well as a whole lot of very smart design people input from the team to come up with what is our best option going forward. We're definitely underway with it, but we need to keep it moving at pace.
Yeah, and so is the best way for us to, you know, to assess that strategic risk is to be a very active observer of some of those things that are happening, if it's in Taranaki or if it's someone that gets a consent to go to water, and the level of investment, because that informs our decision. You know, and again, it's probably to my point, if you're at the front of that trying to solve that problem too soon, you're going to incur a lot of costs that might then get pushed one way or the other through regulation or change in technology or whatever. So you're better off to be close to the front of the race, but be observing what's happening at the front of the race, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there's definitely, you're absolutely right. Where the balancing act for us is that we're now getting to the point where we're running out of time, in that we need to start constructing something in a few years' time. So we do need to very much take those learnings that have happened around the country. We've engaged some people to work with us through that who have been involved in multiple different projects, and so are aware of what's getting across the line and what's not getting across the line, and leveraging that expertise to get the best options on the table that we're likely to get through.
So to loop back to your point, Reggie, you know, what I'm starting to land in my mind is we sort of do some sort of strategic analysis around, is discharge to land best for us, and then how would that problem be solved for us, or is discharge to water?
Sorry, Chair, look, we've been told, I've been told in council that with getting consent, the chance is basically zero, because to get consent from iwi, it's not to do with whether the quality of the water that's being discharged, it's actually where the water has originated from, as in sewage.
Yeah,
so
right.
It doesn't matter, you could have the water that clean, turn it into sparkling water and sell it, and you still couldn't discharge it.
Yeah.
So the chances of getting consent are zero.
Yeah.
So why aren't that's
that's to my point, where so that's something that has to be solved, right? Because if the belief is at a high level that discharge to land is better for whatever reason, but you've got this impasse.
But hold on, we've been told that we're looking at extra treatment. Now, why would we treat it if we already know that iwi will not give consent because of where the water's come from? I mean, we've been told that in committee.
Have we?
we are looking. We will be exploring all options with iwi and other stakeholders.
But we've already been told. So I hate being told one thing and then it changes.
I think one of the key pieces with these journeys is that you don't start with a solution and then take it to your stakeholders. It's very much around building that solution together, and that's the process that we're just kicking off underway. We've had some good conversations over the last 3 or 4 months with Te Ao Marama. We've had them out to the treatment plants, and then we've got essentially a program manager on board in a similar way to what we have Lee Butcher running our Build It projects. We've got somebody on board who's managing that what are we going to do program across these various different consent pieces.
Yeah, and it just, the discussion's good, but it highlights the fact that there's a lot of risk in running really hard at this early. Yeah. And we've just as much as we feel, we've made this da-da-da, I think what we've got to say is, look, let's just step quietly forward, be very informed about the decisions we're making, and keep a very observational role.
It's very hard to be a player in the game when you don't know what the rules are and someone keeps changing the rules.
Right.
Sorry.
So that means you exactly to my point. You just, if you don't know where the running course is going to finish, you don't go to the front and head up the wrong street. You stay back at the pack, let someone else go up the wrong street, and when the judges say no, you're going left, you head left. Anyway.
I don't call that good governance, sorry.
Well, it is in the sense of, look, you're identifying the risk around, you can't be at the front of the race.
Just let me have some input then. I think we just need to err on a little bit of caution here. We're looking to solutions. So we heard Aaron talk about land or water discharge, but we have other options as well. Yeah. So for argument's sake, if the hydrogen plant comes around, and everything's looking rosy at the moment, but there's a big if, the hydrogen plant comes around, it needs water.
That's right.
But it does not need treated water. It can take potable water. Now, they said to me, we could probably take all your discharge water, the whole lot. So that's another thing that we haven't factored in. So I guess I'm just erring on a bit of caution. One, if the election comes around and it's not the current government, the position of ACT and National has been they will scrap the Three Waters legislation, with the exception of the Water Quality Bill and with the exception of the monitoring agencies. So the entities will disappear, and we will be back to what do we do. Yeah. So we need to be considering that as we go forward, because for National, quite rightly, they say the issue is not whether TA should deliver their own, which they're passionate about. The real issue is the funding. Yeah. And in whichever model you're using, either the taxpayer or the ratepayer or a combination thereof are going to pay for this, whichever way you go. 100%. So why dismantle what's a good process? So I guess that's the first thing is. And the other thing that's not in our mind setting, but probably needs to be, is the issue of water meters. And so our water meters are an important thing for two reasons. One, they reduce the demand at the front end for fresh water. And so given our current freshwater supply end being at risk, with just having one source, and if we ever wanted to reduce what goes out the other end, and it could be a combination of water meters and data banks / hydrogen plants may take our potable water, we may not need to worry about where we discharge it. 100%. So there's some potential there, but we just need to sit and wait to see where some of the stuff pans out.
Exactly, yeah, I agree.
Well, the other advantages of water meters is they can help us identify where there are holes in our infrastructure.
Well, that's one of the things I was going to flag a bit later on with, is that, and I'm not talking about Auckland, but certainly Central's got water meters in, and I think it's widely known, and there's more experts in the room than me, say that you lose about 30% of your water through the pipe system if you don't have water meters. If you do have water meters, you can detect where they are very quickly. And so it gives you two things. One, it gives you less pumped in because you don't need so much. So you save 30%, but you also see where the weaknesses are, because obviously a leak's a weakness, and it gets ahead of potential something's a bit more catastrophic. So, but water meters are initially unpopular.
Trish?
Strategically, I think we need to consider things like the consents to keep them moving. If we want to be business ready, so that if we do go into an entity or whatever, we need to make sure that they are a priority, to keep ticking them along so that we're getting closer to where we want to be.
Okay.
So if we just bear with me a little bit, and I'm going to show you some of the numbers shortly. And I think some of those things are going to.
Well, what we might do, Russ, is just hold there and have a sort of 10-minute break from morning tea and toilet, and then come back to this.
I thought you might be better to see the numbers before then. No,
Depends on the numbers. Russ.
We can't all be crying in the toilet.
Right. So we'll break, and we'll be back at 1:15 sharp, mate.
Obviously, iwi are going to have a big say about all this anyway. Obviously, iwi.
So, welcome back to the.
So, Mr. Chair, I'll just go through the rest of these delivery projects. So, we've got future projects about the water intake at Branksome. We've talked a little bit about the timing of what we need in Bluff and how do we create it. I think there's obviously a piece of work that we have to understand where our city will develop over the next 5, 10 or 30 years and actually understand where our infrastructure needs to either lead that development or follow it. I guess that's the challenge and that's the future that ties up with the district plan. And we just need to continue to keep a good eye on what our health and safety implications are. These projects are about, I guess, being ready for some of those things. So understanding whether financial contributions are something for new developments. There are places where people, the developers, may have to supplement input capital into some of the works that we need. For instance, if the water network's not capable everywhere, then if we have to improve it to make sure they can subdivide land, then that's something we need to have a discussion about. We need to, as I've discussed earlier, we need to make sure our models are up to date so that we can actually demonstrate if we put a subdivision in, a big subdivision in one place, what does it do to the network so it operates satisfactorily. And our overland modelling with a big rainfall, where does the water go, and make sure we know what's going to happen. And once again, it's this, how do we plan ahead for some of the numbers that we've got for the project delivery. Right. So this really just highlights our current operational budget. But I think the real interesting thing is this next slide that we've popped into there. So we've pulled the projects that we will have in, I guess, the bids process going forward into a timeline. And this is a reasonably unconstrained. This is us saying these are all the things that we would like to do if we could do them. Timing may be a little bit needs to be revisited. But when you see some of those numbers start to grow really quite large. There's some big numbers in there, and I'll just move on to the next slide. So that's what the numbers are looking like we're proposing to want to spend across the 3 asset areas. So those numbers become quite significant in the first few years. So there's big peaks early on, and that might well be that where the options that you will need to actually work through, saying which ones of these are our most important assets we need to do, and which ones can we push out a wee bit further, and what's the consequence of doing that. So that's what we currently will have in the it's in our forecasting for it to our finance team for them to bring back as part of that budget pack that you will get as part of the LTP. So those numbers are reasonably significant. Each of them are running early on between, some of the sewage and water in some of those numbers in 40s, which is a huge ask for to be ready, and B, for contractors to be able to deliver those successfully for us. So the timing might be a little bit early, but it's the big numbers.
And Russell, that still has upgrade of capacity to Bluff sitting quite a way out. If we pulled that forward, we'd have an even greater peak early.
Correct. Yep.
Have you summarised the assumptions those forecasts are based on?
In these slides?
Yeah.
Not in the slides.
Yeah, it would be useful to see those.
So what I've tried to do is, from the budget pack that our finance colleagues have developed, I grabbed the first 5 years, and the intention isn't necessarily to read them individually, but it actually just starts to look like there's something like over the next 5 years, including BAU for our pipe renewals, there's sort of $300 million being currently suggested. That's there, so that's quite a lot, and you can see the greens are the sewage and then the blues are the water, so you can see by numbers. And I just went through and took any project that was over a couple $1 million and put onto the table rather than necessarily take them all. So the list's reasonably big, but it's really just the intention to do that, and we've got lots of things to occur in those times. So, but there are allowances for specific things that have got some big numbers that are currently assigned as a starting position. I guess that's what we're talking about.
I think the other thing I'd just be clear on is, as much as these are big chunky numbers, the majority of these numbers were foreseen prior to the last long-term plan, which means that when we did our analysis of whether or not ICC felt that we would be better off under a Three Waters entity model or under a go it alone model, we had factored the majority of these big chunky costs into that model, which still showed that lower cost of ICC staying alone with the assets.
What's the significance of the colour coding?
It's just so you can see the difference of the asset group. So that's made it easy. If someone asked me about a wastewater, I could focus on my table would be better. So, but I guess that's the level. That's the expectation of what we think those costs are going to look like, and that's part of it. Will be part of the forecast and budget pack. So just going through like we don't the levels of service in terms of the BAU. We will continue to use the same KPIs over the next 2-year period. Is what we're being suggested by the NTU. And one of the slides we have all talked about is how do we actually maintain this compliance. So, and we've talked about the discharge consents. We need to continue at pace to keep those things that can't be something we let rest. It's something we've got to keep pushing along at. We need to do some work, certainly in the water network security, which includes some backflow prevention. We need to build a water filling station, so where water tankers fill up at the moment, it needs to be improved, and we need to do ongoing testing. To my understanding, and my colleagues over here, we don't currently have a water meter budget included in our bids process.
Yes, we do.
We do. Good. Okay, Alistair tells me we do.
And we've done that as a 2-stage, as I recall, Alistair, one around essentially network readiness, and then the second piece around actually a rollout of meters.
No, it was just one
Was it
one
just
item.
one in the end?
Yes,
Okay.
but it could be spread over more than 1 year.
Thanks, Alistair. So one of the things that we really do want to make sure is that we don't have any unexpected failures, and I guess that's really why one of our projects we highlighted was the Mersey Street rising main. It's one of those mains that is something that we carefully maintain, and it's something that we need to pull forward, and it's a pretty significant piece of work that we need to program. And as we've talked a little bit about from a compliance, well, an expectation is that the Auckland rainfall event is something that no network in New Zealand, I would expect, would actually be able to easily manage as a whole of network. So there's a whole lot of challenges in that space if we get a really, really high rainfall event. So obviously the list of things that we're suggesting looks to lift that level of service and looks to, I guess, increase our level of resilience, and for Invercargill to go forward, that's really the level of investment that we're looking to do to say we are ready for the future. Obviously, how we improve our water quality is one of those things that we have to continue to work on. And the proposed bids have a range of, I guess, options for Otataura and Bluff, and those are some of those options that you will be able to consider. So what I've put here is when you're considering the options, which will be, I guess, part of your LTP process, tried to list some of the things that could be helpful in your decision making process over and above you. So just thinking about how is your strategic investment? When is it the right time to do it, and is it the right priority? About criticality, about failure risk. How important is it to you in the wider sense? Does it align with what your the council's wider desire for housing and spatial planning, because if there are plans for the spatial plan to grow in somewhere, do we have a network that actually mirrors that and actually supports that? What happens if with the legislative requirements? So how high in the priority would that give you, and what does it do to health and safety? So what we've proposed really, is about projects. Ideally, we could have options inside of those, but most of the things that we've got have a project focus in the capital area.
Just on the within your critically failure risk category, that would be significant impact on service. You're classifying that in there? Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've got a number of the rising mains that are single rising mains, that is in pumped sewer mains around the city. And if they fail or have some outage through either a pump station or a pipe failure, then we have quite a significant problem, because that's the way the nature of the beast works. Having some duplication or having some ability to actually reduce that risk is actually what we're looking for in all those projects.
So those 1 to 5 aren't in the order of importance, they're just listed?
No, I've just highlighted those because I think part of your framework where you'll have to consider all your projects across council, and from an infrastructural perspective, they're the sorts of things that we would want to encourage you to also have a view over. Yeah,
because I think that's an important matrix to help councillors decide is, ranking what is the highest priority there. So if I had a crack at it, at the top would be critical failure risk and probably legislative risk, and then coming down. And I think that's important to help us make decisions from a governance level. Is what is the most important thing we need to address?
It's just trying to refresh those things that are in the thinking process. Really, the framework which Rhiannon has for all of the bids has a whole lot of those, but it's just, I guess, expressed a little bit differently and aligned more particularly about the options that we're offering in terms of the infrastructure world.
So just to that point, and following on some feedback we got from Andrew a wee while ago around, we don't assess risk properly. When we put our papers forward to council, that's the sort of stuff we should be seeing in terms of how the particular decision that's been considered addresses those with relationship to these decisions, right? So that's the sort of stuff we should start to see in those papers.
I think probably Rhiannon's framework around how we assess all of these together is probably the best way to address that, Rhiannon.
Correct, yes. So just to remind the councillors that the framework that you adopted a few months ago is what the asset and activity managers are using in preparing their asset and activity plans for you. And that structure includes the strategic aspects that Russell's listed here at the top of there his slide, but also the aspects around, is the change needed because of legislative or health and safety risk, or is it needed because of changing demand? So you'll receive those assessments.
Yeah, but what I'm meaning is when we receive our papers for council, we've always got a piece which assesses the risk. Are we going to be seeing this sort of stuff in there more specifically than we've probably seen in the past, which has generally been a general statement around the risk is this or that?
Yes, sorry. So if my answer wasn't very clear, yes, it will be within the framework that you've adopted in terms of that risk is clearly there in terms of the scoring.
And the paper writer will address those things in the paper.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Good.
I think there's a piece there just around, to Andrew's point, that council does have in place a risk framework. There is work, and I don't know whether Michael wants to make a comment, but there is work around developing our maturity in that space, and you're absolutely right. There's definitely room for us to bring better risk assessment into the council papers, and I think you'll see it in some papers where we're really seeing chunky risk, but we need to bring it more into the BAU papers as well. I agree.
Linking back to these types of criteria.
And at the bottom of the slide is really, I guess, just trying to pull some of the themes that we're seeing, like consenting, which we've talked about, the opportunities and I guess the risk mitigation of an alternative / emergency water supply, and how those connections from potentially Arua into Invercargill, how does it help Bluff supply and how does it help Invercargill? Some of those key high level things. We talked about the high risk of our sewer mains, and that's really is the thing that keeps some of our technical people awake at night. Without having really good modelling and future asset management, your future decisions become harder and harder. So that's why we're looking to invest in that. I guess that's more in that planning phase rather than in the big numbers. And once again, the resilience issue is something that we shouldn't keep too far away from our minds. So I've just popped that table on there so that, which is hopefully what Adina's going to be able to circulate. So as councillors, like in the previous workshops, you can go through and write whether you like them or dislike them. So that going forward you have the opportunity when they come up, you can help us as we write our plans going forward. Not necessarily going to dwell too much on the KPIs because the KPIs will remain the same, and I had a brief look, and I think when you read your annual plan that the performance of the networks from the teams is pretty good. They're mostly green across their KPI performances, so that's pretty positive. But once again, the NTU is suggesting that we don't necessarily have to consult on the KPIs because they will be what we've used in the past.
I think the other piece just is worth that they're very much aligned to the Department of Internal Affairs KPIs that are set nationally, which we have to report on anyway. So we've already got some fairly clear guidance there.
So we'll just step through some of those, but hopefully the things that you will be seeing in your quarterly reports and being the things that you'll start to be able to ask questions on as you do that normally. Often in the asset plans we'd have lots of words, but in this case we've got one very brief paragraph. So what we've currently our position is that the entity J is developing an asset plan for everybody. That's part of their direction, and they have suggested to councils that you can, rather than write your own asset management plan for the three waters, you can use their asset management plan and place an addendum in that plan, which is the Invercargill flavour, and therefore present that to audit as part of the LTP process. So that actually helps us having to go through a full documentation pathway for the three waters, three plans, and that would be hopeful that it will actually reduce our overheads. That's one of the areas that we haven't necessarily got lots of resource. We haven't necessarily resourced up in that area, given that the past has been that the entity is going to be formed, and therefore having staff recruiting in the market's near impossible in that space anyway. So that's what we'll see, is it will be an entity standard plan, and we're proposing that we'll just attach our addendum, which will be our information anyway. It's about their assets and those sorts of things. So
I think it's probably just worthwhile noting that although we have indicated that to the NTU, we believe there'll be significant pressure on them in that space, and so we may have to change tact if we feel that that's not going to provide the right outcome for us. So we'll keep a close watching brief on that.
So my last slide really just tries to pull together some of these things. So the three waters assets that we have across council are some of the most important assets that we do have. The affordable waters reform will take some form. It'll either be where it's going or it'll go somewhere different, and I guess October will be a good time to start to keep a watch in that space. What we've shown today is that we do need to make sure we continue to strengthen our relationship with iwi, because some of those decisions going forward are absolutely key for both iwi and the community, and how we work, how we understand what the available options are for us going forward. The council has some opportunity to carefully guide where your investment level, where you want to invest and why. And working through that is actually may take a couple of iterations. And from my perspective, just making sure you know what you're going to know, why you're doing it, and what you're trying to achieve, rather than necessarily purely looking at the project, because sometimes what you want to achieve might not necessarily be the actual project. You might want to have a different outcome. They are significant projects, and there's still lots of work to do. We just can't sit and wait for them to happen, because they'll happen because we need lots of the right people doing things. I think there are some opportunities for some of the options to be timed a little bit different, but I guess that's our first cut. We need to, where we start. During this process, whatever happens in the Three Waters or the affordable waters world, we have to manage both our staff knowledge, how do we transfer knowledge, and how do we make sure that we actually have those right people across all of our business, including our contractors, doing the right thing for us, because there's an immense pressure on that resource out there. And the team does remarkably well to get the right people doing the right things, and I guess that's reflected in that we have pretty successful KPIs. We've got excellent knowledge, but you've also got to think to the future about how do we retain that knowledge and where do we go. So change is quite a dramatic thing for some of the team, and it will impact them quite a lot. And the key discharge consents are things that we've had quite a range of discussion on, and how important they are to get going, to actually think through what it is we want to do and actually keep progressing. And some of that is actually good conversation, good relationships, but it's also making sure we've got the right level of resource and skilled resource to be able to progress that. But overall, I think what I would like to suggest to you is that the wider team does a pretty good job looking after our systems, and our systems, through council's, I guess, investment over time, is seen to be in pretty good health. I think we're not in that place where we've it's not, we're not getting ahead of ourselves, but it's not running from behind and catching us. So I think on an overall perspective, we're seen to be pretty successful in that space. But that's a good opportunity for Invercargill as a whole to be ready for the future. So happy to take further questions.
Yeah, Trish.
In terms of strengthening iwi connections and relationships, will you consider outside our local ones? Like, if we're going to be in the entity, would it be worthwhile trying to strengthen those beforehand as well, or what's your thinking around that?
So I understand that Michael's already having some discussions in that space, just to make sure, particularly with the affordable water conversation, that we know what everybody's thinking, our position is clear, and that we're just having some open communication in that space at the moment. So absolutely something that we want to continue to do.
Yeah, because it'd be too late when it's done.
Yeah.
I've got one just around opportunities for cost savings around contract efficiencies. And I know you and I have had this conversation around how our contracts are developed with our service providers. So you go.
It's one that Russell Keane will probably have a little smirk about, because we're having some pretty chunky conversations about that at the moment. Our existing Three Waters contract was due to expire prior to the previous time frame for us to move into the new entities. We're now in a process where we said we would extend that for 12 months and negotiate a new contract that got us into the new entity period. And we're just having to have a look at whether we've got the date right on that now, depending on which way reform goes and if it goes. At the moment, the contract we have is very much a traditional contract where we're paying for really what we need, and I would suggest not a lot more. happy if Russell wants to jump in on any of these ones. One of the conversations I've been having with Russell is, but surely we want a contract that is smarter, where our contractors are challenging us some more, where they're bringing value nationally. And what Russell's wonderfully said to me is but we also need to look at what's the problem we're trying to solve, in that we've actually got a network that performs really, really well. I sort of went, oh yes, but are we intervening at the right place? If we were a bit smarter, we might, save some money. But we've actually got one of the lowest debt costs in the country against our assets. So I guess from a contracting perspective, we're not doing it flashy. We're just doing the basics, but we're making sure we do the basics really well. We're talking to our contractors at the moment around, if we changed the model, what might that look like? How could we find efficiencies? And they're basically telling us that the model you're on is about as efficient as it's going to get. Any other model is going to potentially come with some different benefits, but is going to come with more cost as well. So we're not finished in that space at the moment, and we're talking and planning to go up and do a trip to the top of the South Island to talk to some other councils that have made changes in that space and how it's gone for them. But at the moment, the team are doing actually a pretty good job of convincing me that we've probably got this about right.
Yeah, I suppose my thinking is that historically, it's been about discovering the cheapest price, and I think probably there's a different approach which can leverage off the skill set that the potential contract partners can bring, and so we get a really effective outcome.
Yeah.
And so we look at outcome, not price, as the driver, and then who is best to partner with, and then our process of discovering who that partner is goes through a model that perhaps is being used in some other areas of our business. So we end up with a real true partnership, because the feedback I get from the contractors and from Infrastructure New Zealand is it's a win-lose master-servant relationship about best cost, and it's not the best way forward in terms of outcome.
And I think there's a piece there that we need to still work through around, yes, our network's performing pretty well on that model. We're generally reasonably happy on that model, but there's a piece around the broader industry and what's actually best at keeping the broader industry strong.
That's right.
And do we need to pay a bit more to do our part in that space?
And it's a really good point. And if you look at probably the infrastructure industry, and they're no different than any other industry, where they had lots of resources and people, and capital was quite cheap, and so they could sort of expect their business as well. Now they're trying to be as efficient as they possibly can and don't want any more staff than they need, and use a lot more subcontractors. So their business model has evolved, which means, in my view, it puts a lot of pressure on their ability to deliver outcome in an effective way consistent with contract.
And look, to, in defence of the contracting networks across all of our industries, I think they actually give council in some ways a bit of an easy run, in that their costs are escalating out of sight, and yet we're not seeing that passed on to us. It does mean, though, as you say, they're trying to spread what they've got thinner and thinner and thinner, and is that necessarily the space that we want the industry to go into?
Well, we may not be seeing it in the tender price, but we will see it through the contract.
Agree.
As the risk. Yeah, okay. Didn't wake anyone else up, so that's all right.
Listening.
Any other questions? Well, Russell, you owe me 15 minutes because I've got you out at 11:15, not 11 o'clock.
I think there might be one more.
Oh, I've got one. You can fill that 15 minutes in?
Yeah, I'll just take a couple of minutes of the 15. Again, just to reinforce, I think that we need to tread lightly till we get to October, which is not far away. Because if we are no longer to have entities, that will change the landscape for us. And also, it'll be interesting to see whether, if we do get a change of government, where they'll go on the amalgamation of councils as well, which is encompasses three waters, but it actually is much wider than that.
Yeah.
I think it would be my overall view, given that I've got 2 and a bit years left, that on either of those two counts, that we would be better to stand alone. Our track record is such that amalgamating with other councils for the greater good of New Zealand Inc. or Southland Inc. is not in the best interest of our ratepayers, which is what we're primarily here for. So I think a couple of months from now we'll get a clear steer on that. The other issue is if we do end up with a current government with the same or different partners, what do we do in that 2-year framework that we have? So one of the issues, I guess, would be that we need to get some work done and done quickly. So for argument's sake, if we didn't do our alternative water supply and our increased capacity to bluff, which future-proofs our ability to take new industries, those two combined around about $100 million. If we don't do that, then, which I would suggest we would do quickly, because what that does is it loads up our debt going into a system where most of the other big players that are in NTDJ have already got significant debt. So for argument's sake, we've got $14 million, give or take a bit of change, on our network. Queenstown Lakes District, that is smaller than us, has got 160 million. Till we balance that out, our ratepayers are going to be disadvantaged. If we leave it and ask the entity to prioritise that later on, we will be behind other priorities. Growth in Queenstown Lake districts, climate change in South Dunedin, issues like that. So we may not get that alternative water supply as quickly as we actually need it, given that we've got drought conditions. The other benefit I do see is that within the entities, we have quite a large voting power with their one-for-one relationship. That can work in our advantage, but it can work in our disadvantage. And that's one of the things that we will need to sell, because when you listen to Ngāi Tahu talking at the takiwa level, they say their priorities are in 2 areas. They've got other priorities, but 2 of the areas are to deliver better quality water and water systems to areas of high deprivation for their own people. So, and they quote the Ojai Nightcaps and the Mataras and places like that, which is fine. And they're also very passionate about climate change. That could leave us out of the equation unless we push for our deprivation level in South City, which is decile 9. Because one of the things about the regional picture is they look at Invercargill and see it as quite a wealthy area because of our farming sector that's around us, and that we do okay, where in fact actually we've got a pocket, certainly in South City, and that could possibly include Bluff as well, which is 9 of 10 deciles. So the figures say that the people that live on the south side of our city are within the most deprived 200,000 households in the country. And that's something we sometimes lose sight of. So if we go forward in that model, we'll have to pitch that to make sure that we get iwi buy-in on that equation as well.
Righto. Thank you, Russell, and thank you, Russell, and thank you.
Only owes you 10 minutes now.
Yeah, 10 minutes for attending. So appreciate it, and very good pack too. Thank you.
It would be interesting to know, Aaron, if we could do some background work on the potential for water meters. Like, how much would they actually cost? I know they're not popular with about half the population, and very popular with the other half, and so that makes some council members nervous to be isolating that volume of voters, I guess. But I understand from Central, it only cost about $2 million to put in.
Yeah, and I know Alistair's done that work. I don't know that you have the figure off the top of your head, Alistair, but you've definitely done the work around costing.
We do have an allocation in the budget that's been put in front of you, 7.9 million, and it's been programmed rather arbitrarily towards the end of this decade.
If we do, because I know in the central situation, Tim Cadogan did say to me, they recovered that money they put in. I can't remember whether he said 10 or 2, but whatever money they put in to put the water meters was recovered in just 2 years.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing about the CODC experience was the question of whether or not simply having meters in place but not charging for them would drive down usage. And there was the thought that if people saw how much they were using, that would have at least some impact to drive down demand. What they found was that they didn't charge, I think, for the first year. It pretty much had no impact whatsoever. And then the moment they turned the charging on, there was that about 30% drop. It was significant. So it definitely is tied to that hip pocket the demand piece.
And the ability to solve the leaks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
7 minutes now.
Yeah. No, you owe me 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
7.
Russ won't be. Okay, next up we've got housing. So Heather, Andrea, and Patricia.
Thank you, Chair, councillors.
Welcome. You're going to stay where you
are? You'll notice from the first slide on the actual start, we have called it elderly persons housing because we are primarily invested in elderly persons. We do have some tenants who are younger than that with different capabilities, but going forward we are primarily looking at elderly, and criteria is for 60 persons and older. So we are proposing to rename the housing activity to elderly persons housing. So that is why the first slide doesn't just say housing. So anyway, going forward. Obviously provision of affordable housing for our elderly. As I said, in the past we had a period when demand was low and council increased the scope for tenants. However, current demands suggest that the activity should be renamed to elderly housing, which is a true reflection of the nature of the activity as it is now. We currently have the stock of 215 units and are on a program to increase that housing stock with the addition of 4 new units that have been commenced at Stirrat Street, and we're investigating viability of land stocks for the next build as part of the program. Strategic priorities, pretty much as they are. The changing needs of our population, which is growing older and more diverse. Enabling the housing, the needs to grow within the city, and maintaining that affordability for our tenants. And just, we've got, the challenges are increasing demand and aligning that stakeholder expectation with their operational plans. The ageing of the assets and our existing financial model is currently not self-funding. I'll explain a bit more about that in the future. So the current budget shows operational revenue with increased depreciation due to higher values of property. There is a deficit in our operational budget on those figures, and that currently also does not include the capital program. In terms of maintaining levels of service, we have an increasing stakeholder demand. We have an increasing need for our tenants. The recent media report from Presbyterian Support Services has highlighted that they are disestablishing their rental units. They had 50, they've got 25 that will be, they'll need to rehome those tenants before the end of the 12 months. So 25 of those units have already been vacated. Unfortunately, our current waiting list is 18 months to 2 years, which means that an additional 25 potential tenants would significantly increase that waiting list. We are already getting requests from those tenants, from Presbyterian Support Services, to go onto our waiting list now. Also, in terms of maintaining levels of service, there's the impacts of inflation and contractor availability, and the legislative changes that that can happen. We've already done most of those legislative changes. That's in relation to the heating and ventilation, and increasing that, maintaining that level.
Sorry, do you want questions through or at the end?
If you wish to take questions through, sorry.
Yeah.
Chair?
Darren?
Just a quick question. With the Presbyterian support reducing the number of units of Peacehaven, are there applications to transfer over to us for a specific area, or are they going, we'll go where there are gaps?
They would have to come in, at the moment, they would have to come into the bottom of our waiting list. We can't put them ahead of someone else who's currently in the waiting list. So, yeah, it would be seen as being someone else who already is in a situation that they're sitting in an ability where they can't pay now, or they have no housing.
Sorry, I understand that. So therefore, if they were saying we wanted to go into a specific area, they'd have to join the bottom of the waiting list for that area.
Yes, we don't actually do that. So at the moment, our waiting list is that if they would, once they reach the top, and we have a unit that becomes available, if it's not, they get offered the unit. If they don't want that unit, they stay at the top, but we take the next person down.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And is that list organised on purely date of entry, or is it need?
It's on date of entry.
So no consideration for need?
At this stage, no.
That's interesting.
That's my question.
Yeah, right.
It could be if there was a direction that's what the way councillors would want to go.
Very hard to judge, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Do you want to talk to that?
No, that was my question.
Okay.
Was it what was the priority in terms of putting them on the waiting list? And it's just date. Yes. Yep. Maintaining compliance is pretty much basically legislation driven. It's in terms of healthy homes standards. We do regular inspections in terms of any asbestos. We have some flooring coverings that when they are due for replacement or have some issues with them, we will replace those asbestos-based ones. And we have a asbestos management process in place for any exterior covering claddings that might have need penetration in terms of maintenance work on that. Right, opportunities for cost savings and additional revenue. So these are the bits where we might have some questions. So potentially opportunities for cost savings or additional rental revenue, we could be changing our rental structure to move closer to a market rental. That would have an impact currently on our current tenants, obviously, and any future tenants in regards to affordability. They are the rentals we've got now are low, but they are very low income and low asset tenants. Partnership opportunities or disposal would also have an impact on the current and future tenants, not only in regards to affordability, but also potentially in relation to eligibility. While a community housing provider will attract benefits for rental reduction, they also might have a different criteria for eligibility, which our current tenants may not necessarily meet, or which may lengthen the waiting list for our future tenants.
Yeah, Josh.
The people who are in the older units that were established, say, 1950s. Where do they fit in regard to the waiting list? So you said that there's only, it comes in when the waiting list is based on a date. So say somebody's sitting in one of those units and they've decided, we've decided that they need to be replaced. Where do they fit?
So we would find, so we wouldn't take them out of the unit until we've got somewhere for them to go.
Right, so does that mean, I'm just trying to get my head around the thing, does that mean that, say there were 10 units available, they would not be available to those on the waiting, they may not be available to those on the waiting list, they may be available to the people who are being replaced?
Potentially, yes.
So, and further to that, what assessment's done of the need of the people that are applying to the list?
Assessments in what way? Are we
in terms of their need?
So when they apply, they say whether they're currently in current housing or whether they're if they're requiring emergency housing, we direct them to the MSD for emergency housing assistance, because we aren't in a position to provide that. We certainly don't have units just waiting for emergency housing proposals. Most of the tenants that we have on the waiting list are already in some form of housing. It's about affordability for a lot of them.
Right. Okay, and then so just in terms of the opportunities.
Sorry, Grant.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, yep. I think I'll just add to that, because I think the question you might have been asking was just around how are you actually assessed as being okay to go on the waiting list, and that is around the eligibility criteria that we have in place, and it comes down to those things around your current housing situation, your financial situation.
So there is a criteria as well.
That absolutely, and everybody essentially gets assessed and triaged against that ahead of going onto the waiting list.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, like on this opportunity of cost savings, I think we got quoted some costs per square metre to build housing, which was quite a bit above what the market rate is. And then you look at the trend, and I'm thinking around the tiny house thing, that's being picked up quite strongly by people not necessarily who can't afford, but who are choosing to have a different way of meeting their housing need. They may have a tiny house on their adult children's place, and they are the spasmodic, and they might have two or three of them. Instead of them having one big palatial place in the Mount Maunganui, they might have two or three tiny homes around the place that they can move around the country, and then a camper van. So what I'm probably thinking is that type of housing, which is very affordable in terms of a cost, the type of housing that could come into this provision in the portfolio mix? Is a question to understand, I think, as opposed to be answered.
It would be suitable for some of the younger tenants that are coming in. Younger as in 60.
So it has been considered, or is on the consideration list in terms of how we provide for housing?
The majority of the tenants that are actually applying are in their 80s at the moment.
Right.
So steps and things are limiting. So solutions that we have been looking at have been more of a universal design, so that it would cater to people as they age, and also even the people that are coming in when they are in their 60s, they're staying in their homes a lot longer than they ever would do. They're not going into care as soon as they used to 30 years ago.
Yes. Okay. Erin?
Just the other piece to add there is there is definitely the ability to provide elderly housing at a lower cost than the ones that we are currently building. However, we've assessed what the best whole of life value is in terms of how long we want to actually keep that stock in place and how frequently we have to maintain it, replace it, etc. So that's all fed into that thinking, as well as to Andrea's point around making things that work for the widest variety of people, so that we're not having to keep going back in and changing the facilities as different needs of people enter into those spaces.
It's a very evolving market, and it's less than $1,000 a square metre to provide a very good level in terms of all your metrics around regulation. For mine, I think it's an option.
So I've got 4 developments going on that area, but I'll wait till the staff have finished their area because it's 4 beyond what they're currently providing.
Right. Okay.
So a lot of movement at the moment in this area.
I think probably what I'm thinking is that how we've sort of traditionally met the need is evolving, quite strongly, both in the need but equally the way to provide for it, and it's just the way we think about it probably.
I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
So in terms of our proposals for levels of service, we have drafted a housing policy which will be brought through to council for review and approval within the next few months, and that will set out a direction in terms of the policies regarding eligibility, regarding how we are looking at housing stocks and things like that. We are also developing agreed quality requirements for accessibility, for minimal levels of service, including handrails and accessibility, which would meet the changing needs and demands of our tenants. And we're also reviewing, when refurbishing and renewing units, the inclusion of new building standards and what that might mean for us. There's also been some funding provided to us, obviously through central government, for the opportunity for double glazing and some minor accessibility processes, which will also give us some improved levels of service within our current buildings, and of course we're increasing our housing stock.
Is the expectation that when these units are improved with double glazing and whatever else is needed, does the rent increase?
That is not the proposal at this stage.
Yeah, there is a rent increase on a different budget.
Well, question: have we done? And it's probably Patricia. Have we done any modelling? And it's going one back to the costing on the capital growth of the asset. So we can look at it and say there's a cost to having this asset, but equally, I would imagine that just the capital growth of the asset through time, with what's happened with capital values and cost, we would have had a gain in our asset value, which would be in line with market roughly.
Yes, so they're revalued to market every at the same time as we revalue all our other land and buildings. Yeah. So there has been a significant growth. We have got a number which are probably towards the end of their useful life, because they were built in the 50s and 60s. Some of those very early ones are probably getting towards the time where
the improvements, but the underlying land asset value would have grown.
Yeah.
Be interesting to see that at some stage.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what's happening with the people in the old Grand building? Are they in this?
No, that's emergency housing, and that's a private emergency housing cutting facility. It's privately owned.
Oh, yeah. Is it?
Not ours. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Tenants privately owned.
Pardon?
Government tenants privately owned. National, Wellington government people are placed. They're funded to be there.
Agency.
Emergency housing is used as emergency.
Emergency housing, which is it's a privately owned asset, which has got a contract with government. Yeah, which is government funded. Yeah.
Not unlike some others that have featured in the news.
I'll let Erin speak to this.
So this was just to loop in what we have been working on in the background around a proposal for central government funding. What this had looked at was the potential for 100 new homes across 5 years for elderly housing and what it might take to achieve that. We worked up a proposal which was a joint iwi council partnership, and we were looking for, or we still are looking for, central government to come into that partnership. What we have proposed is that if central government supported that, the council would commit funding over 5 years to a total value of $7 million. That's slightly higher than what we had in the previous long-term plan, and essentially would be us stepping up our commitment in line with central government coming to the party to assist us in that space. In addition to that $7 million, council would also provide the land, and we've proposed 3 potential sites for that. And that council would also fund the infrastructure connections in lieu of development contributions. The requirement of funding from central government had been proposed at $27 million to essentially make the dream happen, and that we are still working to try to see if we can find a way to get within the central government criteria and receive funding in that space.
So what's the cost of the project? 50 million?
It comes out, I'm just recalling, at about high 30s, about 38 million. There's just a little bit of a piece there around our land value, because essentially central government usually looks to a 50-50 funding, and that can include the cash contribution of council, the land contribution of council, and the infrastructure contribution of council. What we've proposed is that we don't want Invercargill to be disadvantaged because of our lower land values. So we've used some national averages on land value as to what that amount of land would be valued at, and proposed that back to central government so that we do just tip over into that 50-50 space of a total of, as I recall, just under $40 million total.
So do the numbers stack up there? If we contribute 50% with land plus infrastructure cost plus 7 million, and they put in 27.
And that's what I say. It depends on how you value the land piece.
But the project's.
So if we inflate our land value, then it's a higher total project cost.
Oh right, I see. Oh.
Is will the 27 million be a loan from the central government?
No.
No. So why then would you have a proposed council iwi central government? You call it a partnership. The money's basically coming to council, to do this development.
That's right.
Why then would you break it down and have a proposed partnership? Because all the income off, the rental income off these properties, 100 properties, will come to council to regenerate more properties.
I can answer that.
I think I've just used the term partnership and acknowledging it would be a significant financial contribution from central government.
Because
it wouldn't be an ongoing partnership around the funding.
To be part of that? Do you need the iwi and central government to be part of that? Because the council, the iwi are part of council anyway.
So we wouldn't need iwi and central government to be part of it if we were going to fund the 100 new homes just fully by council. If we want central...
How much are iwi putting in then? I don't see that.
And so at this stage, iwi wouldn't be putting in. What they would be doing is working with us around a model to support iwi outcomes, and that is the criteria that we are... That's the criteria that we're required to meet for the central government.
Council, though.
It needs to be a partnership with iwi to qualify for central government funding.
Gotcha.
Yeah, just going to reinforce that, Chair, because I was involved with this. They're not putting any money in now, but to get the doors open, the way the government works at the moment, you've got to have iwi buy-in. So we agreed that probably about somewhere between 25 and 30% of the houses that we might get might be targeted towards iwi, given where they sit in the social deprivation stats that we have in our city. So that was a way of getting the door open.
Okay, cool.
So just a couple of options for council to consider. The activity is forecast to continue to cover its operating costs going forward. However, the surplus is obviously not enough to cover the cost of asset renewal based on the current annual depreciation amount. We have a considerable shortfall, and new renewals are undertaken over the net debt account for housing, which will move into a deficit going forward. Deferring that renewal program would also result in escalated renewal costs for the future. And any new builds would increase the cost of the activity at the moment based on figures of an estimated 38,000 per annum per unit, which includes your depreciation, your cost of loan interest, and the expected operating surplus. So to balance that budget, we should perhaps consider rating for the shortfall during the next RTP process going forward, rather than passing this on in the future. It's a big one to consider, but it's out there. So
there's a piece missing in that formula though, isn't it? And it's the appreciated asset value.
The appreciated,
because we're accounting for the depreciation but not accounting for the asset value increase.
Patricia, could you?
Can you repeat that again for me, please, Greg?
We're accounting for the depreciation, but we're not accounting for the asset value. Or are we within that P&L each annually?
We count within the activities P&L. We don't, because it's a bottom line. It's an asset gain, so it's only, you can only realise it when you sell the asset, so it sits below the line.
Yeah, but
however,
yes, thank you.
Continue on here. The depreciation, when we're looking at the cost to run the activity, the depreciation is about the it doesn't really come into it, because as long as we can meet the operating costs, so the rent comes in, we can meet the operating costs of running it, and we can fund the renewal. So for this, because you have to remember, this activity at present has no rates impact at all. So we're trying to, it's a self-sustaining activity. So at the moment there's no rates income going to it at all. So we're looking at, and the question is whether we have to look at a different way of doing it, which is what these guys have raised. There's using depreciation, we should have take out of the thing. Michael's going to.
Through yourself, Chair, fundamentally it comes down to the capital in relation to the housing and whether council will invest itself into the housing stock or not. So by council investing in the housing stock and whether you get the government investing as well, that takes the depreciation equation out of the mix. The housing needs to cover its operating costs. It's doing that, and it's contributing some towards the capital component. The major change that's happened, of course, is the value of the stock, as you quite rightly pointed out. That's changed the equation slightly. What that changes is you need to rethink about your funding mix from capital investment. So that's not about whether you need to increase your operating revenues and costs, etc. It's about who's contributing towards that capital mix. And that's why we're looking at those opportunities around government with the 100 homes component. It's also when we'll need to have a honest conversation with council about how much does council want to contribute in relation to that. Because it's not necessarily required to put it onto the tenants from that perspective. You've got to have that discussion as a council.
Yeah, it probably leans a little bit into the discussion around the share of the tax base, doesn't it, as well? Because is it our duty to just fund this need in our community through our rates, or should central government contribute, as they're proposing to in this instance, but consistently through a revenue sharing model? If you could sort of get that happening, that'd be great. Thanks.
Miracle.
Do our best.
Oh well.
Oh yeah, Darren has got a question now.
No, I've got a statement.
Yeah.
I kind of favour us maintaining the status quo in that we focus on elderly housing and catering to the numbers that we do currently. But I also understand that in order to do that, we're going to have to change and digress from our current policy, which is not to impose on rates. To bring the housing stock up to standard, we're going to have to do that. And that's really our obligation as a landlord. And if, by the way, we're a city that rates landlords who have the same expectation on them from central government, then we need to be meeting that ourselves. I am incredibly hesitant about us moving into the social housing need. I don't see that as our responsibility in local government at all. It is absolutely central government's responsibility. And even in a partnership form, because it begins to be part of a divestment down to us. And once again, every election term we become the whipping boy of central government and saying, you keep putting your rates up. It's not good enough, but we do that because central government keeps divesting responsibility for things down to us. So I think maintaining where we're at with the housing stock, but bringing it up to being fit for purpose, is where we should be, and it's going to need some rates money, and I'm okay with it.
Yeah, the only thought I have there is the moral obligation we have to address all the needs of our community.
Yeah, but shouldn't that sit with? So we've always been in that elderly housing space.
Yeah,
but the welfare of the broader community outside of infrastructure really sits with central government.
But shouldn't
and across
as well?
Successive governments, they have continued to let it down.
Why? And I'm just sort of trying to stimulate discussion here. But why should we set aside or prioritise elderly just because we've done it in the past and forego what is a huge need in social housing? Is it okay for a young rangatahi to be brought up in substandard housing?
Yeah, okay. Look, I don't see that as fair. And I'll use the testing poll that I always use of the single elderly woman in a one-bedroom unit in Pomona Street, who struggles to figure out whether or not she can afford to flick the heater on and keep warm at this time of the year. Can we justify to her that the rates go up to help everybody else get into housing? No. Or is that something that needs to be serviced by central government? And that's where I'm coming from. I'm not saying that there isn't a really valid need for other types of housing. I just don't see it as the local government's responsibility.
No, and so why I'm raising it is because I think we absolutely, I believe we have a duty to be cognizant of that need and then to try and meet that need, not of our housing need across the spectrum, right? Now, whether that's through lobbying, and I think the Mayor's very good at that, but equally, do we look at our other community partners, ILT, Community Trust, some of those ones, because really it's about the community we live in, and those we leave behind, it just doesn't sit well with me.
I get that, but do we become a provider, or do we find some non-financial rates impact way of finding methods of supporting other organisations to meet that need?
Yeah, so I probably agree. It's not our need to meet in terms of a financial impasse on ratepayers, but it is our duty to meet that need through other means and mechanisms. Yeah, Michael?
Through Self Chair, I just want to remind councillors about the elderly housing activity, and from that perspective it is purely ring fenced around being elderly housing portfolio, and the social housing component that you're starting to get into is more around what we do in relation to our district plan and working with our community and organisations from that perspective, what land we make available. It's not part of this particular activity. It is a broader discussion from a council perspective. Yes, we definitely have a role from that perspective, as council will know, and making land available and those sort of things, and in our consenting processes. But this activity is around the elderly housing. I think the confusions come in when we were talking about the iwi component with the 30% aspect. That was still with the criteria in relation to our elderly housing portfolio, so it's still elderly housing, not going into any of the social housing component from that perspective. Well, that's not where we're shifting.
I think that in my mind it's actually leaning back against that and say, well, should we just be talking about elderly housing? Is there a wider net we need to give consideration to? So while the paper might call it elderly housing, it's housing for me. But anyway, Nobby?
Probably appropriate for me to chip in now. Here you say you're doing a housing policy. Is that a housing policy in relation to just the stock we've got at the moment, or is it a wider housing policy?
It is just in relation to our elderly housing.
Yep, that's fine. So what Tom and I have been working on, and you've heard a little bit already, is a little bit about the discussion you've had, Chair, with Darren. I think we need to have more fingers in the housing pie than we've currently got. That's not at the expense of the elderly care. The elderly care should be maintained in those 215 units at the current criteria, and they should not be subsidising ongoing growth, because we've got growth potential some other ways. So I just run through a list of what's been happening in the last couple of months. You've heard from Michael and Aaron about the 100 houses, and so what Tom and I were promoting with iwi was that we'd have government support for 100 units, 2-bed units, not 1-bed units. That opens up a different class of client coming in there. So it could be somebody that might want to have their children come as well and stay from time to time. It might open up 2 people, 2 elderly people living in the same unit, having company, being a bit more on a commercial basis. One of the restrictions we have at the moment for that type of development is the issue around our current criteria and eligibility of getting in. So one of the things that we're trying to do with those 100 units and some of these other initiatives is to free up the market for the current family homes. Now, I know literally dozens of people at my age who are sitting in 2 and 3 and 4 bedroom homes that they don't want to be there. They're caught in no man's land. They can't get out and get into our elderly care because their eligibility criteria is they've got too much equity, but their equity level's not high enough to buy into Bupa or into Rowena Jackson's, and there are no townhouses around town. So they're just stuck in those homes with all the maintenance costs and everything else that goes with it. So one of the ways that I was envisaging this is that the 100 2-bedroom units that come on might have a different set of criteria to what we've currently got on elderly care. So it would be for the elderly sector, but not necessarily be at the level that we've currently got it set at, which is really the very sharp end. I agree with what's been said about the need to stay away from the social delivery. That's Koanga Ora responsible to deliver, or an MSD. We should stay way clear of that. It's a problematic area to get into because those units are very, very hard to manage because of the social needs that go with them. So we know about the 100-bed units and we're still pursuing that. We've got Te Puawai down south, which is a 600 section subdivision, which seems to have been paused, and I think as a council we need to initiate some action in that area with the developer to say to him, look, if you're not moving on with it, free it up, because I know there are people, investors, that will be prepared to buy that whole project and to move it forward. Now, one of the levers that we've got in there is we've got Rockdale Park, I understand, as part of the consenting process. They got Rockdale Park, which we own, as a green space. It was a requirement of the consent. Now, if we withdraw that, the consent falls over. And now that's a reasonably strong-handed way of doing it, but we can't just sit here with that development sitting there on the horizon, because what happens with that is other investors are not prepared to come into the field when they see that sitting there with potentially 600 houses to go there, but nothing's happening with it. So as a council, we need to move that along. In recent weeks, I've had approaches from 3 different developers around Donovan Park, which we've been talking to Michael about, and trying to move that as quick as we can, because we have other needs in our community as well, and the other needs are in 3 areas. I don't know how you quite put this, but quality housing, I guess, or top-end housing is a need. We've had feedback from the WHR group and from the Woodside group, and Woodside in particular say if there are not enough quality houses around, their top executives will not come here and live here. They'll fly in, fly out, which we don't want. We want them to be able to build here. So we don't have enough space in that area. So as a council, we are required, like all councils, to make land available where we can, or rezone so that some of it can be residential. So working as fast as we can with the staff to change the district plan to allow some of that area in North Invercargill to be developed, and changing the classification from reserve to one of the residential clusters so that we can get in there.
Yeah.
Now, opening it up then opens us up to joint ventures. So
yeah,
far,
we might have to sort of pause there.
Yep.
So yeah, and loop back to sort of the conversation about the elderly, just around the, I mean, the important discussions, and I think we leaned into them a little bit yesterday at Wellbeing on Tuesday, sorry, but it's probably slightly outside, and we're testing the boundaries of a public forum versus a commercially sensitive negotiation.
Well, I wasn't going to get into that, but what I was saying is that when you get to joint ventures, that opens some options for you.
It does.
So instead of us just providing, or instead of just government providing, there are developers who will, given, I mean, you heard what Michael and Aaron had to say about us providing infrastructure and land free of cost to a joint venture with the government, and the government will build the houses and then we get them.
Yes.
Well, we've got developers that are also interested in that sort of concept as well.
Yeah.
So I think we need to start thinking outside the square on that.
Yeah.
And I guess the last area, or two areas of need, is we've got a need now in our city for retirement villages, which are slightly different to aged care villages.
Yeah.
So they are, if you see the ones up north, they are people that are retiring out of the farming sector around Southland, who would normally transition to a townhouse in the city and then go on to aged care as that health need required.
Yeah.
But there aren't any of those middle steps there.
Yeah.
The townhouses are not available. They're short. There's very, very few of them come to the market. So they are wanting retirement villages now, which is a different twist again. And then the last thing you raised is the issue of the tiny houses. We've had a presentation from them. I'm still connected with them, and I will do some further work with them. But that requires us as a council to change our thinking around how we might allow 4 or 5 or 6 tiny houses to cluster together on one piece of land.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge potential for people that are young, that are struggling. That's that part of the market.
Yeah. Well, if you
or a solo person.
Yeah. One of the problems with the challenges with the tiny house thing is the needs of reclassification of the number of units, because it's measured by kitchens, I think.
Yep.
Amount of kitchens within the units.
I know.
So, yeah.
And so we should have some serious thinking around that as well, because there's real potential there.
Yeah, true. So, righto. Anything more?
Just a little bit on measuring performance. We're not intending to change our key performance indicators very much. Maybe add one regarding maintenance inspections, and perhaps a trigger point in terms of renewal programs or refurbishment programs.
Why does 95%? Why can they not be 100% occupied? Is that a maintenance require?
That allows us a bit of room for refurbishment and maintenance and we allow ourselves about 6 weeks for a tenant moving out to a tenant moving in.
Yeah. And that's classified as occupancy, even though it's someone is coming in, so it's.
They're not occupied. We don't consider them occupied if the tenant's moved out and the new tenant hasn't moved in. So yeah.
That's a bit of a.
That they are because the tenancy agreement isn't signed until they actually move in on the day, or the week before.
Yeah. You raise a good point, because the private sector look at income sources. So they'll say, if somebody moves out and nobody else moves in for 8 weeks, I've got a loss of income, so that drops the percentage down. We should be thinking about, is the unit available? How quickly they move in and out is irrelevant.
Yeah, I think
the only thing that would stop that is if we did a major fit out.
Yeah,
that took it away from that.
I think that's a better indicator of an actual sort of provision of the service.
Because that implies that You know, we've got 215 units. That implies that whatever that works out,
11 or
12 units
vacant.
are constantly vacant. That's not the case at all.
No. Okay.
The asset management plan is included in the wider property asset management plan. And just a wee bit on risks and challenges, obviously our ageing stock and increasing demand. The current rental income doesn't support the renewal plan we have. You know, just that consideration for rates investment if we're looking at that. That's us.
Any final questions? No? Okay. Well, we are ahead of time. Do you want to do your democratic process discussion now?
Yep.
Yeah. It'll just keep everyone on task and put you between them and lunch. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Kia ora, councillors. So the democratic process essentially covers the work of two teams within council. Michael Morris couldn't be here today, so I'm going to talk about his elements relating to governance as well. So here's a little summary of the areas that are covered within the democratic process activity in the governance area: elections, council meetings, procedural documents, support for yourselves, and the chief executive and the leadership team, and all the legal advice and support that council requires as part of its operation. And then the other parts of the activity are within the strategy, policy and engagement team. Strategy and advocacy, I've just drawn out climate change as one of the particular areas of topic we've been working on recently. Corporate planning, obviously this part of this LTP process is all part of that, as well as annual reports and annual plans. But also I've drawn out the SOI process, the statements of intent for different parts of the organisation, but particularly economic development, the Great South contract, all our bylaws and policies that guide the way that council actually implements its practice. And then finally, the community engagement and activation. So that includes consultation and engagement, grants and funding, and the activation activities.
So community boards would be included in the
Yes, the Bluff, yep, support for Bluff as well, yep, really good point. So really, I think I've drawn out the most relevant strategic priorities that you focus on at the beginning of this LTP process. Really crucial to this activity is supporting your leadership and decision making. Some of the things that are affecting the work of the democratic process activity is the changing demography, needs and expectations of the population. And I think people's expectations of what local government is, of what democracy is and how it should function is changing. We're seeing that in national trends in terms of changing or lowering levels of satisfaction with councils across the country. And also a changing expectation of how community should be involved in decision making. Local government is a representative democracy system. The community elects yourselves as councillors to make decisions on their behalf for the best interests of the city. We run consultation and engagement in order to be able to inform your decision making process and make it as useful and as efficient as possible. People are increasingly looking for more collaborative approaches and ways of working. So that's something that really is probably at the core of thinking about how the democratic process looks going forward. I think we are also seeing on a range of issues increasing political division and divergence of views amongst the community, with quite strong views on different sides, which makes managing the consultation and engagement process more complex. So this is an overview of the budget within the democratic process activity. significant amount of that budget obviously goes to some of those aspects, such as Great South's contract is within this budget line, all the funding allocation that you give through the Community Wellbeing Fund, as well as all the core operational activities for democratic process. So the points that Michael wanted to draw out in terms of the governance aspects of democratic process specifically was just the increased work there is around the Lagoima requests and Privacy Act issues. So as community interest in particular parts of council activities grows, that increases that work. Obviously, community interest is really positive, but there is then a resource required to serve that. Council is doing a lot, which is great in terms of outcomes for the community, but as I think you're all aware, you're meeting quite frequently, both formal council meetings and workshops, in order to be able to progress that business through council as fast as efficient as possible, and that requires an awful lot of governance support to enable that to happen, to provide you with the information that you need to make informed decisions, and then to liaise with the rest of the organisation to be able to enact those decisions. Finally, Michael's just flagging the ongoing, again, national trend. Invercargill still sits very favourably in relation to the rest of the country, but just engagement with the election process itself, there is always just a slow, genuine, general decline in terms of that process, and a lot of work's gone in to try to raise awareness, allow people to engage in different ways. Different communities are increasingly saying it would be useful to them to have ways to vote that links to the places that they meet, which is great, and it's really good to be able to respond to those needs, but it is more resource intensive to be able to do that. The second thing I think that it's useful to draw out is that community engagement piece. I've covered it briefly at the beginning of this presentation. I'll just note further that the local government reform paper does outline in quite a lot of detail potential future direction forward for local government in terms of moving into a more participatory space. There's opportunities to look at ways of testing that out in various forms. Indeed, Council has supported various collaboration projects to achieve better outcomes, and that's happening in different areas across Council. The Costello Park Legacy would be one example of that, but increased resources is necessary to enable that community engagement to work effectively, because it is a longer process. As a minimum, really suggesting that we need at least a 0.5 extra FTE to support community engagement, and an increased budget associated to allow activities to take place. So I've just shown an estimated cost for that. In terms of where you could save money as it comes to the next stage of the process, when you're looking at ways to manage the budget increases, you could consider reducing the Community Wellbeing Fund, or reducing the levels of funding to one or more of the grants to the external organisations that are funded through the long-term plan. So that's just something that you could consider. Another aspect that I think that you might want to give some thought to is the Welcoming Communities programme. This is an aspect that again is linked to central government policy. It is an important program in terms of supporting the increasing numbers of newcomers to the city. It is intended to primarily support migrants and refugee integration, but also just general newcomer integration, no matter where people are coming from. As we see increased diversity of locations that people arrive from to the city to live and make their home, retention of people is important. And at the moment, Council is operating this program with no dedicated resource. We are adding additional projects as and when we can, and so it is recommended that we do need some resource to enable that to move forward. Finally, and a really important one, which I'll speak briefly about in terms of the regional work that's been going on, climate change. So a lot of work's been happening to assess what needs to be done on the two main pillars of climate change, which is mitigation and adaptation. So in terms of reducing the carbon impact of council's own activities, there are two aspects of this. There's first of all the ability to measure and actually know what is happening in terms of our carbon impact, and there is a minimal amount of funding that is required to enable that to happen, to pay for the external consultant. Also recommending that you consider an internal contestable fund for carbon mitigation actions and or offsetting. So as a starting point for consideration, we're recommending $200,000 a year. So essentially what that would be used for is for any team across council who has a carbon reduction activity to be able to put forward their proposals for what that might look like, and for money to be available to invest in those activities. Then council could consider, if any of that fund each year was unspent, you could either use it to offset your carbon impact by purchasing carbon offsets, or rolling it forward to next year, essentially. And I know the finance people are going to tell me that's the wrong term, but essentially meaning you don't have to increase the rates quite as much the next year. And finally, we don't yet have an indication from Environment Southland as to what the funding requirements are likely to look like on this, but we do know we have received the report which you received back in March from a consultant showing that we're not able to do the full assessment yet as to the risk that our city assets are at from climate change, because further data analysis and modelling is needing to be done. We now do have the core data, has just been finalised from LIDAR, but there is quite a lot of further modelling and assessment which will take quite a considerable amount of time to land. Environment Southland are in the process of analysing what that might look like, but we do not yet know how much it might cost. The coastal inundation part is the part that is the most important to the city, so I'm just putting in a placeholder there, given we don't know the cost implications. And finally, in terms of measuring the performance of the democratic process activity, the two KPIs you can see at the top are KPIs that we already have, and we're proposing keeping those, but adding two new KPIs, which would be around climate change and voter participation in elections. And those would monitor some of the other aspects of the activity. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Right.
Look, I'll start at the back and work forward. So the climate change one. Now, where did we factor that into sending a delegation to Kumagaya? Obviously, jet travel, international jet travel, huge impact on climate change. There's no denying that. Do we have to buy carbon credits to do that, or this is we don't want to be hypocritical on this.
You raised this at council once before and it didn't get anywhere.
Oh, I don't think so. I think it was.
I don't recall it getting anywhere.
Patricia.
Through your chair. I do
so
recall.
I need to withdraw this, Darren.
I'm wondering what your expected outcome is.
Yeah.
No, to keep the chair happy.
Patricia.
I'll withdraw it.
No, well, it's...
In relation to Kumagaya, the council paper that went up in relation to that asked whether council wanted to offset the carbon credits in relation to the travel. And if my recollection was correct, we voted against it.
We did.
Right.
We voted against it.
Yeah. I've got is there any other?
Okay, the next one's regarding CCOs, and obviously you mentioned Great South. Now, accountability there, I don't believe we are seeing accountability via the mechanism that's listed in their SOI. In their SOI, it states that they have no surprises policy via the shareholders committee.
Is this related to governance?
Yes, that's right. I'm saying the governance is that we don't have that accountability in governance.
I could speak briefly to that. So you will be receiving papers to the August council meeting on these matters. That's probably the most appropriate time.
Yeah. that specific issue.
Yeah.
Right. And
You're referencing a decision that's been made by them recently, right?
No,
Or
I'm
just
talking
generally?
just general.
Okay.
Yeah. And
What's next?
The other one is about your engagement for the public, the ability to influence decisions. Okay, it was quite a low percentage, but I think that my take on it is that the public's main ability, and their first ability is in the election process of who they vote for, because really, if they're going to vote for X person, might be a well-known name, might be something, might be anything, or they vote for someone who they actually align with. There's two different ways of voting. So if they like to align, and I suppose it's getting to know the candidates better, whatever, but by putting someone in that you can hold accountable, then that's a start of influencing governance. Okay, then after that we've got consulting and stuff like that. But if you don't get the first bit right, you know, as far as the public goes, they can't really say we don't have any way to influence it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Just, you had a thing there, Rhiannon, 21 FTEs? Yeah, back on one of the first slides. Yeah. So that's actually directly people involved in the governance process at the council, or is that sort of pulling part, people that do some work in the governance space, but maybe another?
That's across the whole democratic process activity. So that includes all of the governance support, but also all of the strategy, policy, community engagement, activation, and management of the SOIs. All of the whole activity. Yeah.
Okay. So then, with your request for, particularly around, you know, community voice and some of those things, have you looked at how you could sort of redistribute workload, change focus within the existing FTE thing, or is it? I think there was a reference that you need a 0.5 FTE.
Yes. So I'll speak briefly to that, and then Michael might have something additional that he wishes to say. So yes, across the engagement and the welcoming communities, we're proposing we need another FTE. We are extremely lightly resourced compared to most councils in the engagement space. We are already only covering all of the work through an extreme amount of juggling act. And the issue that we're facing is that there has been quite a significant and steep change that we are experiencing in the community in terms of how they want to participate and the risks to council staff of managing that participation safely. So part of that speaks to the point that Councillor Pottinger was making, in that people are wanting to get more involved in decision making, in terms of engaging more deeply and over multiple hui in some areas. And then the other area is we are seeing some parts of the community being more heated in their views, and creating situations where we need to have more staff present in order to manage those conversations in an appropriate way.
Okay. So did you want to, Michael?
Through Self Chair, look, the only thing I'll add to that, because Rhiannon's spoke very well on that particular item, the only item I'd add is that we are compensating some of the gap, I would say, in relation to those public events by actually using staff from outside the governance process to help support. So we have those coverage, and that does include using some of the executive team to actually be present in those particular meetings to make sure that we have the right support available to our teams. We are running a fairly lean governance team by comparison across the country.
So what from here you would actually put up a paper what would detail out some of the sort of high level explanation you've just given in much more granular detail for a decision? Is that what the next process would be?
So the same for every activity, you'll receive the activity plans later this year for review. But the next stage of this process is budgeting. So there will be workshops bringing all the options forward. But that's why we're seeking feedback now from everyone and your perspectives, and that's how we'll build the final plans.
Nobby?
So I'll just run through my view of the 3 areas that have been thrown up. In the first one on community engagement, they've got an estimated cost of $75,000 for a part-time position. So that means an FTE of $150,000. So it'd be interesting to know what we're actually in recruiting there. That seems to be an awfully high salary. I know there'll be factors in there around vehicle use and potential other
office
costs.
Space, consumables, computer.
Yeah, I know, but that even if you factor 10 or 15% out of it, that's an awfully high salary range for somebody who's going to connect with the community. So I don't support that. Well, hang on. I'm just giving my view on here, and others can then contribute. So we had a community development team, for those that have been here long enough to remember, which is under Mary Napper in the past. We wiped that function away with good reason. So I don't support that. I don't support any reduction to the community wellbeing fund. I'd need a paper to justify what the impact that is. And I often hear people say within council, why do we have such an annual commitment to that fund when we've got ILT and CETOS in some areas contributing already? But it's too easy just to say yeah or no on that. So I'm nervous about reducing that down. And on the welcoming communities things, it's my understanding that we've already got some government and some ILT funded positions already in the community. So down in the old Plunkett rooms sitting down on 4th Street, there is an organisation in there that does exactly that. They welcome in different ethnic groups. Plus we've got the multicultural network within the city that seems to work reasonably well. You see them here at all the citizenship ceremonies. So again, I'm not supportive of that either. And on the issue of the climate change, I mean, the 3 outcomes that are there are way too subjective for me. Certainly around a contestable fund. I don't know whether it's the council's role to have a contestable fund anyway, which is $200,000 a year. And then the final thing there around our coastal inundation stuff. Look, I've been listening for probably the best part of 2 years, waiting for Environment Southland to get that leader data to us. They don't have it yet. Until we've got that, we've got no idea of where this will impact. But it seems to me that the leader information is more about water flows within our rivers as opposed to what's actually happening on the coast itself. So again, from my perspective, I wouldn't commit to any of that until, because it suggests a $75,000 a year contribution until we had a whole lot more data from Environment Southland as well. So that's my view of the world.
Brandon?
So just to clarify specifically on the community engagement part, you're right, that would be a high salary for that. It's not intended to just cover salary. At present, we have a very small, almost non-existent budget for actually hiring venues, printing collateral, all of that kind of thing, which really limits the ability of us to run a lot of the hui. So that part of that is a proposed increase in that ability to actually fund.
Sure, I understand that, but I guess if you're going out to the community, are we now splitting off and saying, well, I'll go over and talk to Darren over there because he's just part of the general community about engagement, because that's one of our core functions to do that. But then I'll go over and talk to Michael because he's a new immigrant or he's come from Gisborne recently, and I'll talk to him through a separate process. I mean, I would have thought community engagement is community engagement. If we've got barriers for people coming forward, which I suspect we have right across our population, we don't get a lot of participation at a lot of stuff we put out for public consultations, and I've heard Rangi and others talk about that in the past. We put out something for public submission and we get 20 or 30 sets of feedback. It's pretty dismal from a ratepayer base of 25,000 or whatever it is. So we've got a problem right across the board, and why are we just targeting some new immigrants or some migrants, whatever? I think we've got groups in our community that already help those people come forward anyway. I think we've got a much wider problem, and that's what we should be potentially targeting, not just having somebody who goes out and talk to migrant groups or people that have come from outside Invercargill, which could be somebody coming from Dunedin.
Yeah, I think if we come up a little bit, it's important, but it's equally challenging, isn't it, to sort of hear the voice of the community, but not be sort of captured by a few noisy voices in the community.
Correct.
And I think what I'd be keen to see, I think it's really important we sort of stay as connected as possible to our collective community voice, and then how you use really innovative and modern stuff to connect to them. So your Survey Monkey thing pops up, but there's probably more iterations of those sorts of things that happen on social media with your TikTok, which Ringy will be able to tell us about, and those sorts of things. But just so that we can, you're not going to get the solution, but there's two things you're achieving. One, you're feeling as though if people want to have a say, they can, in a forum that's appropriate, and there's a responsibility there for both to provide and to use properly. And then secondly, how you collate up that voice into a centralised sort of, okay, what's the overall theme that's coming out of this? But equally, I think it's important to, and I think Rhiannon outlined it really well, is, you have got right through globally, very secular groups emerging around very particular interests that can make a whole lot of noise and can get quite aggressive in their approach to get the outcome that they see for them, which is poorly considered in my view. So we've just got to be cautious of how that evolution of society is impacting on voice and all those sorts of things. So it's a blooming difficult
there's always been lobbying, but it's certainly more aggressive now.
Yeah, so we've got to think through to, in my view, it's really important we have community voice as a key part of how we make decisions and informed decisions, both immediately and long term, and then how we can collect that up on a most effective and efficient way to reflect that voice, but using technology that sort of restricts, the just growing cost.
So I would support that initiative if it was a wider perspective and not just migrants and things like that, because you're quite right. I mean, look, I've been out to different groups recently in the Pacific area, and then I've had people approach me from the Samoan area, who are one of the two largest groups within the Pacifica cluster, and they say they feel a bit lost in that wider thing. It's a little bit like when you talk to disability sector. They'll say they've got 23% of the population are disabled in one form or another, getting down to wearing glasses as well. But then when you go and talk to the blind or low vision people, they feel quite lost in that wider cluster. Yeah. So how do we get to those smaller voices is the key issue, and how do we set mechanisms in place where we can get to groups that, one, aren't good with technology, or two, don't have English as the initial language. So somebody coming in from Colombia is going to struggle to input into something here.
And that's where I think this, in my view, goes, is how do we solve that problem, which is, and it even is, there's no better benefit than pressing the flesh with people,
Sure.
And just, so maybe us as councillors need to be more active in our constituents.
Well,
now some are and some aren't, right? But so is that a process we get into as part of an overall governance consultation role? How do we feed that voice back and not just put our hands on that voice?
And again, when we first started out, when I first started out in council, I posed that problem to people. You come here, you get a mandate from the community because you get X amount of votes, but how do you still keep connected? I mean, you get it through if you play golf or you're involved with the rugby union, whatever, but it's not wide enough.
No,
and we don't capture them. And it was good that we went out. Rhiannon's team went out recently and did the 18 to 30-year-olds because we got a lot of information out of that we would not have expected. Well, I wouldn't have expected. So we will continue to look for opportunities now. If that involves a half-time worker, I'd be really supportive of that. But just narrowing it down to just those small groups, to me, is going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, Darren?
Yeah, I can accept and agree with that. There were other ways of consultation that we've used in the past, some of which are no longer open to us. We did use regional television and did live talkback for a while, which was fraught, but innovative and well received. We used to do clinics where we went out and people could come, we had a couple of councillors designated and people could come to us and talk about anything they wanted. Now, they weren't hugely used, but they were an opportunity. But what it seems to be that we're getting feedback that people are looking for, and this comes to what Nobby's been saying and what we've experienced with some recent Mata Waka engagement, is that people want us to go to them, and them is not a large collective group, it's small individual groups, which is just, in some senses, beyond, or the sort of thing that you might be able to do once or twice a triennium, but bearing in mind how much time just the regular work of council takes. And while we're using more online options for people giving feedback, sometimes what we're getting by way of feedback is just quite simply trolling. Again, you've got to be careful about how you apply weight to it. But it's a necessity, because the ways of us communicating what it is that we want to people have changed dramatically, and the traditional methods are no longer as have the same reach that they used to. But it's going to require more resource, and supporting that, I think, is a good idea. Another innovative thing I saw in there was the potential $200 contestable fund for carbon reduction. Now that's thinking outside the box. It was raised, I think, in a previous workshop, and I think it's a great idea that might inspire people from within the organisation to think, okay, what can we do? Because you've got how many staff and how many potential ideas, and it's regardless of what we're waiting from in the way of leadership from the regional authority around climate change. It's a step that we can start to take ourselves and say, when someone says, well, what are you doing? Well, here's something that we're trying. And I think that's really, really good.
Yeah. My question there, and it comes up in the commercial world, is should you have to incentivise people in their role to do that thinking, or should they just be doing it anyway? And my challenge would be, in the current world, if you're sort of not thinking about the impact of climate change and all those sorts of things and everything you're doing in your role, you perhaps...
But is it incentivising, or is it saying this is the amount of money we're going to put into it? Who's able to come up with suggestions for it best to be put to use? Because it's not, I don't see it as being paid to the staff directly. It's going towards the projects to reduce carbon.
Michael?
Yeah, just to give some perspective for council and thinking about all those engagement activities that you've talked about, I just want to remind us we have just come out of COVID period, and the nature of our activities has changed significantly pre and post, and we're starting to get back more into that physical activity and personal engagement component. So some of the things that we were doing in the past are starting to happen again, particularly around those big community events. We've had a number of those recently where we've brought a lot of people in to have discussions. And that's what we're alluding to, is it was easy to manage when we didn't have those events. We didn't have our people having to be out there. We're starting to see that coming back on, and it's becoming resource intense. So that's primarily what it's indicating, is there is a resource gap in relation to that. As we've changed and gone through the COVID period, we're able to cope with it a little bit better during COVID, because we weren't physically connected from that perspective. We're having to do a lot more remote sessions, but now we're increasing our physical presence out there and community engagement.
Yeah. So just before I come to you,
yep.
Nobby, there's a paper, another workshop going to be held on this specifically, is that what you're thinking?
So no, you'll receive the items for decision as part of the next report rounds, and you'll make those decisions, and we're taking all the feedback from these workshops to finalise what's brought to you.
Right. Yeah. To me, it's quite a wide topic that's probably worth a specific another workshop on, I think, because it's really important we get this right. In my head even floats around, are we fulfilling our roles as councillors as fully as we should be, or should there be a review of councillor remuneration so they can become more, have more time available to do this sort of thing? I mean, it's one of those things you have to ask the question too, right? Who should be getting the voice? Should it be governance and staff, or staff collecting it for governance? What all those sorts of things need to be discussed and determined. Nobby?
A couple of things. Just respond to Michael's one to start with. One of the things I've been thinking about is we carry quite a few vacancies, a significant number of vacancies actually. I think one stage 40 or 50. I would have thought that this sort of activity spread where you want to refocus your organisation would be within your control and wouldn't require an extra position potentially added to the system. That we would have that capacity already to focus somebody for a year or two. But I agree with you, Grant. But when we go to consult on major issues, we get very poor responses. And one of the things that we should decide before we go out to consultation is how do we actually want to do it? Is the traditional way of doing it, like Darren says, it's not serving us well. Can we as elected members also target groups? So if we want to sell Rugby Park, for argument's sake, if that was something on the agenda, we'd have people here that would go and talk to the rugby union. But you know, if there are wider issues, where do we get out? I mean, it was a standing joke when I first joined council, and Leslie won't mind me saying this, that she used to be everywhere with her red coat on, which is her Labor coat. And look, and even today, everywhere I go in the community where there's issues around multiculturalism, about migrant workers, wherever, she's always there. So that's a challenge for the rest of us to be out there and engaging in that way. Now, not everybody's got that time and space, but we should target. Yeah. So if we want to engage on a particular issue, who's going to put the hand up and go places?
And I've been thinking about that quite a bit. We'll come to you, Rangi. And maybe that's a function that we could use the governance staff to do, is to create those opportunities. For example, the schools. You know, maybe it's an opportunity to go and sit with school children, with the schools and talk through them at assembly time, for example. Might be a really great opportunity for us as governors to go out and just hear the voice of that particular constituency, right? Even though they don't vote, they're still an important voice. Or that's just the example. But so maybe that's.
But I think we should target issues if we've got something specific we want to go to. Because if you just go and sit at a school, you can talk about lots of things, but it doesn't really impact what the staff are looking for, engagement on some key issues.
Well, I was thinking about going out to listen, not talk.
But it comes down to everything and each individual issue, because some of the stuff we go out to consult on is not interesting to people. So, and that's why sometimes there's little feedback.
To the Mayor's point, I think we need to step right back to a governance level and say, okay, what are we trying to achieve through this, and then how's the best mechanism to achieve it? And is it us? Is it staff? Is it a combination? Is it technology? Is it interest groups? Is it general catch-ups? Whatever but we've got to have an actual strategy. And almost come even further back, we've got to have a vision for what does really good governance look like for us around community engagement. And then that leads us through to our actions, which leads us through to our...
I think one of the good examples for that was a couple of years ago, we had the rent increases with our units. And we just put that out in a document and assumed that everybody sitting in those 215 units would engage. And of course, clearly they didn't, but it created a real storm. And we'd thought ahead of that we might have put a couple of councillors and a couple of staff members out to a meeting just for those people, buy them long morning or afternoon tea involved.
And all it took was one piece of misinformation.
It did.
And they turned up.
Blew out of control.
And it's a good point, isn't it? Because you can have the best intentions around governance, but if your actions don't connect with that, you shoot yourself in 2 feet. Did you want to say something before I come to you?
Yeah, so just to respond to the suggestion of having another workshop, we could certainly do that. Last LTP round, we workshopped this in detail, and it's all within the significance and engagement policy that directs our principles for engagement. That was all put together by the previous council, so we can certainly review that. Every report that you receive on a particular issue or consultation includes the proposed approach for the engagement, and we vary it for every single issue
it does.
to be specific to the stakeholders involved, and whether it's a broad public interest issue or whether it's specific stakeholders. Every approach is varied. Providing those varied approaches is more labour intensive because you need to change up what you're doing for every situation. We certainly have a councillor-led approach to all engagement, and that's why I'll often be on the phone reaching out saying, hey Darren, can you come to this particular hui? I guess I would advise it will be a very labour intensive from the collection of the feedback point of view if you have no officers involved in that. In my experience, that is a step that is beyond what should be the councillor's role. Somebody has to collect the information and put it formally into the decision-making process. But we certainly always looking for innovative new approaches, but it is labour intensive.
Yeah,
So
but
that's just reinforced exactly what I said.
Yeah.
Which was we need to look at the much wider picture of how we engage with our community, not just the smaller ones that we've got here. And I'd support a position that did exactly that, and so that we should take the initiative to say, hey, it's not a matter of just going out.
So to your
we
point,
should take some ownership of that as well.
If you organised a workshop, you went down and had a hui, and someone come up with a really great idea, and you directed them to go to our app and put that feedback in, because that's great app feedback. We want to capture that. You know, that to me is smart, as opposed to councillor trying to remember what was said or staff member turning up to try and recall what was said. Let's leverage technology to capture the voice. You know, so we've stimulated the discussion, capture the voice.
I mean, a good example is we had on there today, I think, on one of the presentations about a potential transport link with Bluff.
Yeah.
Now, logic would tell me, why haven't we surveyed every household in Bluff to find out how many people would use a bus? Yeah. And if we have, and we find out there's 50 trips a week, then you might put on 3 return trips or 4 return trips. If there's 200, then you might put on a whole lot more. But we just don't seem to engage that way.
No, that's right.
We get a new idea, we jump in and do it, and then find out the buses have only got one person on.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Rangi, did you want to?
Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah. So do you want some direction around whether we have a separate workshop on this particular issue now, or what are you feeling?
Oh, I'd like to have one. I think that's the big gap for us.
I think it's a good opportunity to bring in the new councillors who haven't had any input to that before. So.
And we've also got a few voices missing that are pretty important to hear from this here, haven't we?
Yes.
Michael, any view? Now you've got a question. You've
Sorry.
had the opportunity.
Fine with the workshop. I just wanted to touch base just on the FTE side of it. I think that's got a lot of airtime, but it's actually quite confusing, because it's actually not actually about FTE in relation to resourcing, because it's about whether you want the work to be done or not. And quite rightly put from the mayor is when it comes down to resourcing that, I need to work out the balance across whatever resources I've got available to actually achieve that outcome. But it's about whether you want that work done or not. And I know my CFO down the end will tell me she already allows for my vacancies and assumes I'm not going to recruit a certain amount during the year. So I'll need to do some dealing down the end in relation to that. But from perspective of FTEs, it's quite right. I need to work within whatever FTEs I have, but it's whatever budget that council want to get from the ratepayers and what services you want to provide. So we probably worded it wrong by saying it's an additional FTE. It's an additional work requirement.
Yeah. Rangi, did you want to?
Yeah, well, it's really, 13 years on council, and what I've seen is, in my own experience as well, is that just human nature is that, like, unless you're affected, you're not really too involved.
That's right.
And a classic one will be Sandy Point management plan. Yeah, and that's going to get a lot of feedback because of the diverse use. I was a ratepayer for 25 years before I even realised, what council actually did, and which affected me. So I didn't really go to consultation. I just stood for council. I thought that'd be an easy way to sort the problem out. Is from the inside.
You still think it was a good decision?
Yeah, I'm working on it. It's work in progress. But really, like, if you look at the role of a councillor, like the Local Government Act actually has a job description for the mayor. It does. It's quite clear what the mayor's role is, but there is no job description at all for a councillor anywhere in the Act.
But that's an opportunity for us to, to sort of.
Well, it'd be great to actually, we could create our own.
It looks like for us.
Yeah. I get phone calls every day. People ringing up about stuff. I got one yesterday that the Don Street now feeds onto D Street, and the sensor that realises there are cars in Don Street wanting to get onto D Street has been misbehaving. So I got a call to, and of course Russell Pearson sees my name come up on the phone and goes, "Oh shit,"
So it is true. Barking dogs bark with dogs, right?
And anyway, so it works. I think the councillors, if they get familiar with us, I think that's the best way. Is make yourself very open,